Hey guys, tonight we're heading straight into the icy heart of medieval Europe. No insulation, no electricity, and definitely no central heating. We're talking freezing stone walls, thatched roofs with wind slicing right through, and just enough fire to toast one side of your body while the other remains a popsicle. You probably won't survive this. Seriously, medieval winter is less cozy castle and more frostbite in your soul, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know down in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside your little timber-framed house, breath already curling in the air like smoke. The sun's barely up and frost crunches underfoot. There's no thermometer, but your fingers know it's below freezing. You wrap your coarse wool cloak tighter, but it's not doing much against the wind. Inside, things aren't a whole lot better. The fire's long since died out overnight, and you're facing another morning of coaxing flame from embers with cold numbed hands. This is the cold reality of medieval winter. Whether you're a peasant scraping through in a one-room cottage or a lord tucked away in a castle, winter is the great equaliser. It seeps in everywhere. Your walls are made of wattle and daub, a mix of mud, straw and woven sticks, so you can feel every gust of wind that snakes through the gaps. And roofs, usually thatch. Charming in storybooks, less so when the snow starts to melt and drip through at 3 AM. Let's be clear, central heating is several centuries away. There are no vents, no radiators. The closest thing to insulation is hanging a tapestry or stuffing rags into the cracks, and windows, if you even have them, they're just wooden shutters or animal horns scraped thin. Glass is rare, brittle, and brutally expensive. The darkness isn't just cosy, it's mandatory. Keep the shutters closed and pray the cold stays out. Now imagine you're in a town, maybe York, maybe Cologne. It's winter 1325, and the streets are ankle deep in mud and snow sludge. The market's quieter, the air smells like wood smoke, dung, and desperation. People move slower in winter, there's less to trade, less to eat, and far fewer reasons to go outside unless absolutely necessary. The firewood vendors are out, dragging wagons of damp logs, and you can bet they'll try to gouge you for every coin you've got. No fire, no life, it's that simple. But let's zoom out a bit. This isn't just discomfort, it's survival strategy. The whole structure of medieval life shifts during winter. Agricultural labour winds down, people huddle indoors, nights stretch long and oppressive. The rhythm of life slows dramatically, like a heartbeat in hibernation. And yet somehow people get through it, most of the time. Here's the thing though. Death in winter is always lurking. You probably know someone who won't make it to spring. Infant mortality spikes. The elderly fade out quietly. And even the strong can be taken down by cold-related illnesses. Things we now call pneumonia, influenza, or just plain hypothermia. There's no thermostat to bump up, no ER to run to, just a dwindling fire and hope. You'd think castles would be better, right? Bigger fire, thicker walls, sort of, but that's for later. For now, your average medieval person is just trying to keep the fire going day in and day out, with whatever scraps of wood, peat, or even dried animal dung they can get their hands on. Not glamorous, but it burns. And this is where the social dynamics start to shift. Winter pulls people together, literally. Entire families, sometimes with servants or farmhands, cram into one room to share body heat. Privacy, that's a warm weather luxury. You sleep in a row, pressed shoulder to shoulder, feet to face, head to goat. Yeah, sometimes the livestock sleep inside too, but we'll get to that in a later section. It's efficient, if a bit fragrant. Still, even with all that, some nights are just brutally cold. You can feel it in your teeth. The fire doesn't last long, and someone has to stay up to tend it. Usually that job falls to whoever's least liked. You'd rather be cold than firekeeper. The guilt if the coals die out is heavy. You can't just strike a match. Starting a fire from scratch in the dark with flint and steel, not fun, especially when your fingers barely bend. Now here's a fun, weird little fact. Some medieval folks believed winter cold could sneak into your body and freeze your organs. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a living thing, an invisible creature creeping into your bones. Superstitious? Sure, but when people start dying in their sleep and there's no visible cause, you start to suspect foul forces. There's even debate among scholars today about how much of wintertime illness was blamed on cold humours, part of the medieval medical theory that categorised body fluids and their imbalances. A lot of treatments involved warming the body from within, and not always with good results. Of course, we can't talk about cold without mentioning the Little Ice Age. From roughly the 1300s to the 1800s, Europe went through a long, drawn-out cooling period. Rivers froze, growing seasons shrank, and winters hit harder than usual. That means if you're imagining medieval winters as just a bit chilly, think again. Years the Thames froze solid. Fairs were held on it. But back in your cottage, that means an even tighter belt, fewer crops and longer, darker nights. Fun times. Still, the human brain adapts. You start to crave the weight of wool. You cherish the glow of coals. You invent rituals, little games, stories or prayers, to get you through the night. Winter becomes not just a season, but a mindset, a siege. And your fire? It's your fortress. By now your teeth have stopped chattering and your eyes are heavy. You hear the crackle of a neighbour's hearth somewhere nearby, and for a brief moment the world feels safe. Cold, yes, but endurable. You wake to the faint sound of coughing, and the low rumble of someone stirring the fire with a poker. It's still dark, of course it is. In winter, the sun shows up late and leaves early, like a bitter guest. But even in the dim light you can see it, the open hearth, right in the centre of your one-room world. The heart of the home, literally and symbolically. It's barely more than a stone-lined pit with blackened soot climbing the beams above it like ivy. No chimney yet, just a smoke hole that doesn't do its job very well. You cough reflexively, not because you're sick, but because this is just what morning feels like. The hearth is your lifeline, your kitchen, your furnace, your social media feed. It's where people gather, gossip, tell stories and warm their hands while praying that the logs catch. Firewood doesn't just appear. Someone chopped it, dragged it in wet, stacked it crookedly, and now here it is, hissing, popping, spitting at you like you're an angry cat. If it catches, you're in luck. If not, it's back to puffing into a pile of half-dead embers until your face is redder than the fire itself. Smoke fills the room fast. Your ceiling's dark from it, and your lungs sting even though you've long since gotten used to the smell. In fact, everyone smells like smoke. Your clothes, your blankets, your hair. If you're lucky enough to have an outer cloak, it's double duty as a smokescreen and a heat trap. You sit close, not too close. The fire doesn't love you. It burns quick, dies faster, and leaves your backside frozen while your knees start to roast. There's no iron grate or fancy surround. Just a ring of stone or perhaps a patch of hardened clay, blackened from years of heat. Cooking pots hang from a spit or sit on tripods over the coals. Ash collects in little piles that you sweep aside with whatever's handy. Maybe a bundle of broom straw, maybe your foot. It's not pretty, but it works, sometimes. Your neighbours might have their hearth in a different part of the house, some off to the side, others still sunk in the centre. The central hearth is common in early medieval homes, especially in the earlier centuries. It's practical. It spreads heat more evenly and forces everyone into the same huddle. A fire in the middle of the floor means everyone orbits it like satellites, shoulder to shoulder, steam rising from wet socks and cloaks hung nearby to dry. And forget about stoking the fire with seasoned hardwood like oak or maple. That's for kings and well-stocked monasteries. You're burning whatever burns: willow, birch, scrap lumber, dried cow dung if things get really desperate. Some households collect peat from nearby bogs, carving it into heavy bricks that smoulder forever. But smell, well, not great. Charcoal's out of reach for most, too expensive, too precious. That's fuel for smiths and higher-end kitchens, not commoners. Still, that hearth is your everything. You can't heat water without it, can't bake or boil or brew. If you want warm ale, porridge or broth, you're doing it here. You want dry clothes, sit by the hearth, want to stop your baby from screaming at the icy air, wrap them up and place them beside the coals, under supervision, because if that toddler wriggles too far, well, medieval parenting comes with high stakes. But here's the weird part. The fire wasn't always for warmth alone. There are layers of belief wrapped around it like blankets. Some folks believed the hearth fire protected the home from spirits. Others swore never to let it go out completely, fearing it would invite illness or misfortune. Superstition or safety net, it didn't really matter. If your fire died, you were cold, you were vulnerable, and in some minds cursed. Now, modern historians still debate the logistics of all this. Could one fire really heat a home with no insulation, no ceiling to trap the warmth, and a roof vent that let out more smoke than it should? The answer is barely. In fact, thermal imaging tests on medieval reconstructions show that while the hearth helps, it leaves most of the room hovering just above freezing in winter. It's not enough to make you cozy. It's just enough to keep you alive. Mostly. Some of the more clever folks developed tricks, hanging heavy wool tapestries on walls to trap heat, blocking wind with thick furniture, sleeping on raised platforms or wooden beds to get off the cold floor. But all of this comes back to the hearth. Without it, you're sunk. And don't imagine peaceful Weihnachten either. That fire pops, cracks, and sometimes just dies on you. You have to tend it constantly. Blow on it, feed it, stir it like some ancient, petulant deity that demands attention and offerings. Someone is always assigned to the fire. Usually it's the younger kids or the old folks who can't do field work. They sit nearby, poking the logs and waiting for someone to shout, "More wood!" like it's a full-time job, because it is. Despite the smoke and the danger and the lung damage, people loved their hearths. They told stories by them, sang songs to pass the time, and treated it as the literal and spiritual centre of the household. In some cultures, women weren't even allowed to walk away from the fire during childbirth. It was considered bad luck. And when people died, sometimes a new fire was kindled in their honour. A clean flame for a clean soul. So tonight, as you sit watching your medieval self carefully build a pyramid of kindling with frozen fingers, think about this. The fire is more than just a heat source. It's the only thing between you and the cold, sure, but it's also your light, your kitchen, your entertainment, and your security. One little flame, flickering against a world that wants you frozen stiff. No pressure. By now your eyes have adjusted to the smoke. Not that it's gone. Oh no, it's still hanging in the air like a low fog of regret. But your lungs have made their daily compromise. You blink, watery-eyed, and glance up toward the ceiling. That's when you notice it again. The blackened rafters, the slow drift of smoke toward the single sad opening in the roof, the infamous smoke hole. Every medieval house has one, and it's both genius and curse. Picture this. You've got a fire in the middle of your home, no chimney, and no windows to crack open. You need a way for the smoke to escape unless you enjoy living in a slow-cook barbecue pit. Enter the smoke hole. It's exactly what it sounds like. A roughly cut hole in the roof, often directly above the hearth, designed to let the smoke out and just enough of the weather in to ruin your day. On good days, the smoke finds its way up and out, floating gently through the thatch or the wooden slats above. On bad days, which is most of them, it backs up, fills the room, stings your eyes, and makes you question your life choices. There's no damper to adjust, no vent control. The air pressure decides who wins, you or the smoke. And now let's talk about the roof itself. You're probably imagining something quaint, like the homes in those fantasy video games. Plump little cottages with whimsical curves. But in reality, thatched roofs are engineering miracles that also happen to be highly flammable, drafty, and favoured nesting spots for mice, birds, and other freeloaders. Straw or reed is stacked thick, often over a wooden frame and held in place by a mixture of mud, dung, and sheer desperation. They insulate, sort of. Thick thatch can keep out some cold and trap a bit of heat, but it's a double-edged sword. Too much smoke trapped beneath, you're gasping. Too much wind whistling through? Now you've got an indoor breeze. Rain? Oh, it's coming through eventually. Drip, drip, drip. Especially when the snow melts. During winter, the thatch becomes a sponge. Snow piles up, then melts slowly under the weak sun or heat from inside, and the result is a perpetual game of dodge the drip. You've got buckets in the corners, rags laid out on beds, and the faint smell of mildew creeping into your wool blankets. There's no escaping it. You live in a half-damp sandwich with fire in the middle. And yet somehow you adapt. People in medieval Europe weren't clueless. They developed clever tricks to work with their terrible smoke holes and leaky roofs. Some built a kind of hood over the hearth, basically a rudimentary smoke funnel that helped guide fumes toward the exit. Others shaped their ceilings with a slight slope to encourage airflow. It wasn't architecture so much as a series of experiments in not dying. Some wealthier homes, especially in the later Middle Ages, began adding actual flues, early chimney prototypes, though they were rare and expensive. For most people, the smoke hole was a constant in their life, part of the architecture, part of the air and part of their health problems. Respiratory issues? Check, soot covered everything, double check. But hey, at least the bugs didn't like it. Smoke was a surprisingly effective deterrent against pests, especially in the upper thatch layers where all kinds of creepy crawlies loved to live. Now here's the fringe fact of the night. In some areas, smoke holes weren't just practical, they were symbolic. In parts of Scandinavia and the British Isles, the smoke hole was seen as a spiritual threshold. It connected the house to the heavens. Souls were said to leave through it. When someone died, it was common to open the smoke hole wider or make sure it remained unobstructed to let the spirit pass. So not only was it your home's one real form of ventilation, it was also, in a weird way, its escape hatch for ghosts. Sleep tight. Historians still debate how effective these smoke holes actually were. Some argue they created more problems than they solved, while others believe they were part of a larger architectural strategy to balance heat and airflow in drafty medieval homes. It's a fine line between cosy hearth and indoor wildfire. Archaeological evidence from reconstructed medieval buildings offers mixed results. Some test huts actually maintained a tolerable temperature, while others smoked out their volunteers in under an hour. Guess who got the short straw on that research project? But back to you, sitting there in your smoky, half-warm room. You've got a fire going, your smoke hole is doing okay, and the roof hasn't dripped on you in at least 5 minutes. Life's good, relatively speaking. You can still hear the wind scratching at the shutters, and your breath curls in front of your face when you stand up, but compared to being outside, this is heaven. You stretch, cough, blink the soot from your eyes, and glance over at the roof again. You wonder how often they had to replace the thatch. Answer: a lot. Every 10 to 15 years if you were lucky, and you had to hope thatched roof fires didn't cut that timeline short. Because one stray ember popping upward into dry straw, that's a show no one wants tickets to. And let's just say fire departments weren't a thing. Your best hope was a neighbour with a bucket and fast feet. That's the strange contradiction of medieval life. Your fire keeps you alive, but it's also the biggest threat to everything you have. There's a reason why medieval towns had strict rules about where and when fires could be lit. Especially in tighter urban areas, where one thatched house going up could mean the whole block becomes ash. It happened often. Too often. So you learn to respect the fire. You feed it carefully, never recklessly. You build your thatch thick but not too dry. You say a quiet prayer to whatever patron saint looks after homes and hearths. And when the wind howls too loud or the snow begins to fall heavy, you keep one eye on the smoke hole just to make sure the fire knows who's boss. You finally get a chance to visit the local castle, not as an honoured guest, mind you, but maybe you're delivering something or tagging along behind someone who knows someone. Either way, you step through the gates, past the icy stone walls and into what you've always assumed would be a warmer, grander version of home. And for about 5 seconds, it is. The walls are tall, clean and lined with tapestries. The floors are solid. There's no smell of wet goats. You almost start to believe the nobles live in cosy luxury, until the wind slaps you in the face from inside the hallway. Yeah, welcome to castle life in winter. Cold stone, colder shadows, and a whole new kind of misery wrapped in fur trim. You pull your cloak tighter and follow the torchlit corridor. Your boots clicking against the damp flagstones. It's dark. The windows, few and narrow, are little more than slits carved through stone, designed more for archers than for sunlight. No glass here, just oiled parchment or wooden shutters, and the cold leaks through like it owns the place. The truth is, castles aren't warm. They aren't designed for comfort. They're built to keep people out, not keep heat in. Most rooms are enormous, with vaulted ceilings and drafty gaps in the stonework. The thick masonry takes forever to heat up, and once it does, it rarely holds the warmth for long. You sit by a fire for hours, stand up to leave, and it's like walking into a meat locker. Your breath fogs in front of your face, and your nose turns red before you've made it halfway down the corridor. You're guided into the Great Hall, arguably the warmest room in the castle, and even that's pushing it. There's a massive fireplace big enough to roast a boar, and it's been burning all day, but it only heats one side of the room. People cluster near it, as close as they dare, their backs roasting while their fronts stay chilled. You do that awkward medieval shuffle, turn a little, warm your left side, rotate, toast the right, repeat. It's like rotisserie peasantry. Now if you're a noble, you have options. More fireplaces, more servants to keep them fed, and more furs to wrap it around your shoulders, richer fabrics, thicker walls, even heated stones wrapped in cloth and slip beneath your feet. But still, it's cold. The bedrooms, even in royal chambers, are frosty tombs in winter. You sleep in a 4-poster bed with heavy drapes, not because it's romantic, but because it traps your body heat like a human terrarium. Without it, you'd freeze before the first rooster crows. Here's the quirky detail that sticks with you. Some castles had fireplaces built into the walls between rooms, so one fire could warm 2 chambers. Smart, right? Sure. Until you realise that these shared wall fireplaces were also perfect conduits for sound and gossip. You warm your hands while hearing the full report of someone snoring, or arguments in the next room over who gets the last turnip. Heat and secrets, all shared through a single wall. And now, for the scholarly head-scratcher, some researchers argue that castles were never meant to be fully heated in the first place. The goal wasn't to make the whole place cosy, it was to warm zones, just enough to keep the important people functional. The rest, cold on purpose. Think of it like a medieval space station. The control room gets power, everyone else bundles up. Others believe that the great halls could retain heat through body warmth during large gatherings. So when the Lord hosted feasts, dances or meetings, the combined body heat actually raised the room temperature a few precious degrees. Party as insulation. Nice. But for everyday life? You learn to live in layers. Nobles wore wool beneath their silks, fur-lined cloaks over velvet. Rich ladies carried hand warmers, small metal boxes filled with the glowing embers to hold while sitting through chilly court rituals. Lords might pace or practice sword forms just to stay warm. And children, shoved into bed early, stacked like firewood beneath woolen quilts. Everyone did what they could. As you tour deeper into the castle, you reach the kitchens, one of the few reliably warm places. Not for comfort, but for chaos. There's a dozen fires going at once, ovens baking, pots bubbling, servants rushing to and fro. You feel heat at last, glorious and sweaty, but it comes with the scent of onions, ash and panic. Still, some servants sleep here during the coldest weeks. Accidentally, of course. Get caught and it's back to the freezing barracks. Outside of the castle, peasants like you probably imagined this was paradise, but once inside you realise something. Even surrounded by stone walls and roaring fires, people are still cold. They're just cold in store, and as you pass by a noble muttering about how the firewood is too damp and his toes are absolutely frozen, you realise you're not so different after all. Just slightly less spoiled. Firewood in castles is no joke, by the way. Entire crews are responsible for keeping it stocked, cut and carted to the various hearths. Some rooms, like the armory or the chapel, are left unheated entirely, except in rare cases. Fires are rationed, managed like military supplies. Even kings didn't want to waste a single log. A roaring fire might look impressive, but it was also a drain on the estate's budget and manpower. Heat was political. In some wealthier castles, especially by the late medieval period, they started installing more advanced chimney systems and wall flues. You even find rudimentary forms of central heating, like floor vents from lower-level fires that warmed rooms above. But those were rare, experimental, and prone to accidents. Smoke leaks, backdrafts, sometimes even carbon monoxide buildup before anyone knew what that was. So while the technology existed, it was temperamental. Heat a floor, gas a noble, oops. So as your visit wraps up, you walk back out into the winter wind, and suddenly your smoky little cottage doesn't seem quite so bad. Sure, it's cramped, smells like cabbage, and your roof leaks, but at least your fire is close, your bed is near, and you're not walking a mile through a stone hallway just to warm your toes. Luxury, maybe not, but survival, absolutely. And that's the thing no one really tells you. In the medieval winter, everyone's cold, castles, cottages, kings and cooks. No one's immune. The only difference is how far you have to walk for a fire, and whether someone else lights it for you. You're back in your village now, standing outside one of the smaller homes near the edge of the fields. From the outside it looks like a lopsided loaf of bread. Thick, rounded walls, low roof, barely any windows. Humble, sturdy, possibly alive. This is a peasant's cottage, and it's about to be your winter headquarters. You duck through the crooked wooden doorway, and immediately you're greeted by a gust of warmish air tinged with smoke, damp wool, and something vaguely cabbage adjacent. Welcome to a wattle and daub house. Sounds poetic, right? Like something out of a bard's song. But it's actually a survival tactic turned building method. Wattle is the woven lattice of sticks, hazel, willow, whatever bends with it without breaking. Daub is the mud, straw and manure mixture smeared over the wattle to seal it up. Basically, your walls are a medieval sandwich. Sticks, then mud, then hope. You glance around. The interior's dim, the smoke hole above barely visible through the haze. It's a single room, dirt floor, with a hearth sunk in the centre and blackened timbers overhead. Light struggles in through gaps in the walls, There are no windows, unless you count those irregular slats between the wood where the wind whistles through like it pays rent. If you press your hand against the wall, it feels cool and soft, maybe too soft. The daub tends to crack in cold months, letting in more air than you'd like. Some folks stuff cloth or hay into the holes, but it's a losing battle. The wind doesn't knock politely. It barges in, grabs your cloak and says, "You live like this?" And yet, you do. You huddle in the warmest corner, usually near the fire, and you make it work. The thatched roof above you droops slightly from moisture. The beams creak in the wind. But this cottage, this little patchwork cave, is all about compromise. It doesn't block out the cold exactly, it slows it. Gives you a fighting chance. In the better constructed cottages, the walls are thick enough to keep the worst of the wind out, and the roof is steeply pitched to let snow slide off. In places with heavy rain or frost, people often add a layer of turf on top of the thatch for extra insulation. It's clever, it's also heavy, sometimes too heavy. There are stories of roofs collapsing midwinter because someone got ambitious with the turf and underestimated how much wet soil actually weighs. Now here's the fun fringe fact. Some houses actually reuse their daub. During warmer months, they'd scrape off damaged sections, remix the mud and straw and reapply it like a medieval stucco job. It sounds like a Saturday DIY project from hell, but it worked. It was cheap, sustainable, and just sticky enough to make kids want to help until they got it in their hair. You settle onto a low bench near the hearth. There's a single bed frame against the wall, maybe two if this family's doing well, and the rest is sleeping mats, bundles of rags and straw. No real insulation, no mattresses, just layers. Layers of everything. Blankets, cloaks, old sacks, whatever keeps you off the icy floor. Some people line the floor with rushes, fresh ones when possible, but more often the kind that crunch ominously when you walk over them. Warm? Not exactly, but better than frozen mud between your toes. The fire, once again, is your only real heater. It's small, underfed and smoky, but it keeps your fingers flexible and your water unfrozen. There's no chimney here either, just the same smoke hole situation and the same constant coughing. In fact, you've started to notice that everyone in the house has a bit of a rasp. That's just the price of admission. Your lungs are getting smoked like hams, and there's not much you can do about it. Now, here's the scholarly argument that never seems to end. Were medieval cottages actually warm inside once the fire had been burning for a while? Some historians say yes, that a small space well constructed with thick daub and a consistent fire could maintain survivable temperatures. Others argue that even at their best, these homes were barely above freezing in winter, and warmth came not from architecture, but from proximity, to fire, to animals, to each other. There's evidence for both. Reconstructed cottages in open-air museums show that when the fire is going strong and the wind isn't howling, the interior can reach tolerable temperatures. Not cosy, not sauna level, but maybe the kind of warm where you stop seeing your breath. That's the gold standard. You lean back against the wall, listening to the muffled howl of wind outside. There's not total silence inside, never is. The roof creaks, smoke curls into your face. Someone across the room shifts under a pile of blankets, muttering in their sleep. The fire crackles, spits, and above you, through a gap in the thatch, you can see the stars. And now for your quirky human moment. Some peasants believed that drafts were caused by mischievous spirits. If the wind whistled too hard through a crack in the wall, they'd call it the breath of the dead, or blame fey folk for pulling at the corners of the house. It sounds silly now, but when you've sealed every hole you can find and your house still groans like it's alive, you start to wonder. Maybe it is. The morning comes slowly in a place like this. There's no rush of sunlight, just a grey light that creeps across the floor, touches the cold walls, and doesn't do much else. You rouse yourself, pull your cloak close, and prepare for another day of doing everything you can not to freeze, tending the fire, fixing the walls, patching the thatch, fighting the cold like it's a person knocking at your door over and over again. Is not glamorous. It's not even really warm, but it's shelter. And in a world where the only other option is the cold open field, that makes this damp, smoky, slightly sagging cottage a kind of miracle. It's night again, and this time you're not the only one curling up by the fire. You shift your blanket to the side, scooting over to make room. Not because you're polite, no. This is survival mode. The cold has arrived in full, a thick and merciless chill that presses through the wattle walls and drips off the roof like ice sweat. Every breath comes out like fog. The only thing left to do, huddle. You're in a pile now, not in a cute slumber party way, but in a full-on sardine stack scenario. Everyone in the household sleeps close together, sometimes on a shared mattress of straw and rags, sometimes just on the dirt floor with a blanket thrown over the whole human heap. There's a surprising number of elbows involved. You learn quickly not to move too much or breathe through your mouth unless you enjoy a lungful of foot aroma. It's not just your family. In leaner homes, servants, farmhands, or even visiting neighbours might join the pile if the weather's bad enough. There's no hierarchy at night, just a shared goal: stay warm, don't die. The oldest folks are usually in the middle, along with the youngest children. You, somewhere near the outside unless you've earned middle status with age, parenthood, or sheer tactical positioning. The idea is simple. Bodies generate heat. The more bodies, the more warmth. But it also means you sleep with your knees pressed into someone's back and someone else's breath on your neck. And the smell, well, you get used to it. Sort of. Sweat, smoke, livestock dander, old wool, maybe some onion from dinner, clings to the air and to your skin. Bathing isn't frequent in winter, and laundry is even less so. Water freezes in the basin, and washing clothes means risking hypothermia, so you marinate. Still, this isn't just a desperate act, it's tradition. People expected to sleep in groups. It wasn't seen as odd or shameful. In fact, sleeping alone was a luxury, even among the rich. Beds were often shared between siblings, servants, or guests. Personal space? That's a modern invention. In medieval winters, bodies were your best insulation, and there's no such thing as awkward when it's 5 degrees inside your house. Now here's the fascinating part. Even nobility slept in groups more often than you'd think. Travel accounts and household records describe shared sleeping arrangements in manor houses and castles. A noblewoman might sleep beside her handmaiden. A visiting knight could share a bed with a host's son. Sometimes it was about warmth, sometimes about safety, sometimes about trust. The bed was as much a social arena as it was a sleeping space. But for peasants like you, it's all about necessity. You shift again, carefully, so you don't jostle the child sleeping on your arm, and think about the fire, now reduced to red glowing coals. It can't last the whole night. Someone would have to get up and stoke it, but no one moves. Everyone is in that strange half-conscious state where you're awake enough to hate the cold, but too tired to do anything about it. You hear someone snore, someone else coughs, a baby fusses and is hushed with a soft pat and a muttered prayer. The walls groan as the wind rises outside, and a bit of straw flutters down from the roof. You pull your cloak tighter and try to ignore the fact that you can feel your own nose going numb. You might think this is temporary, that there's a warm season just around the corner. But no, winter lingers. It's not just December to February like you're used to. It can start in October and claw its way into April. That's half the year spent battling the cold. And if you're lucky, the summer doesn't bring a crop failure, which means less firewood, thinner blankets, and fewer bodies in the bed next winter. Now here's a bit of medieval ingenuity for you, the bedgown. It's a heavy outer garment, not quite a coat, not quite a dress, worn for sleeping and lounging. Both men and women wore versions of it, sometimes over their regular clothes, sometimes instead of pyjamas, which weren't really a thing. These garments were meant to trap heat and were rarely washed. Over time they basically became wearable blankets, stiff from smoke and sweat and survival. You also learn to sleep in cycles. Without artificial light or reliable heat, people often broke the night into 2 sleep periods. First sleep and second sleep. You'd go to bed shortly after dark, wake up in the middle of the night to tend the fire, check the livestock, maybe even talk quietly or pray, then settle back in for a few more hours before dawn. That middle of the night pause? It wasn't insomnia. It was the norm. A rhythm dictated by firelight, cold air and communal living. Of course, not everyone enjoyed the privilege of indoor heat. If you were a shepherd, a watchman, or just very unlucky, you might be sleeping in a barn, in a shed, or under a lean-to next to your animals. And sometimes, especially in the harshest winters, people just didn't wake up. There's no romanticising that part. Cold was cruel. It took the weak, the poor, the forgotten. You knew not to speak of the neighbour whose fire ran out or the infant who went still in the night. You just gripped the body next to you a little tighter and waited for dawn. Now here's a quirky debate that historians still toss around. Did medieval people like sleeping together like this, or was it purely utilitarian? Some argue it fostered community, strengthened bonds, even helped with mental health during the isolating winters. Others say it was a miserable necessity, and that people jumped at the chance to sleep alone the moment they could afford to. Either way, It shaped the way people thought about home, comfort, and connection. The fire pops softly in the hearth. Someone must have gotten up after all. A few orange sparks drift upwards toward the dark thatch. You close your eyes again. Warmer now, thanks to the body heat, the wool, the familiarity of it all. The wind presses against the door like it wants in, but for now, you've got your pile. You've got your fire. You've got another night survived. And in the medieval winter, that's the dream. Sleep in a tangle of limbs and breath, pray the fire holds till morning, and thank the stars above that you weren't the one on the outside edge of the pile tonight. You wake up feeling like a cooked dumpling, sweaty on the inside, crisp on the outside, and vaguely alarmed. Someone's elbow's in your ear, and your knee is half numb from being pinned under a particularly robust uncle or neighbour or goat. It's hard to say who's who in the pre-dawn grey. You peel yourself out of the human pile like bread dough from a bowl, breathing in the full glory of medieval morning. Sour wool, cold ash, stale breath, and last night's cabbage stew. Nothing like it. Now it's time to get dressed. But here's the thing, you're already dressed. You slept in your clothes. Everyone does. Taking them off would be ridiculous. Winter dressing in the Middle Ages isn't about fashion. It's about layers, and the strategic deployment of every wool, linen, and fur scrap you can get your hands on. The goal is simple. Trap heat, survive the wind, and maybe avoid frostbite. First comes the shirt, always linen. It's itchy, usually off-white, which is generous, more like beige stained by life, and long, sometimes down to your knees. Then trousers or hose, often tied at the waist and maybe even at the knees, depending on your region or how fancy you're feeling. Over that, a tunic. If it's cold, which it always is in this scenario, you'll throw on another tunic, and maybe another. Then comes the outer layer. A cloak, usually wool, thick and coarse, fastened with a pin or a tie. Wool is your best friend. It keeps you warm even when it's damp, which it often is. It's heavy, scratchy, and smelled like the sheep it came from, but it's also life-saving. You wrap it around you like armour. It may not stop at arrows, but it fights off the cold better than anything else you own. And let's talk about headwear. You need something up top. Heat escapes through your scalp like it's making a run for it. Most people wear the woolen coif, tight-fitting caps that look vaguely like you're planning to rob a bakery. Sometimes a hood goes over that, attached to a cloak or worn separately. Add mittens or gloves if you have them, though they're a luxury. Most folks just shove their hands into their sleeves or under their arms and pretend they're fine. Now comes footwear. Oh boy. Shoes in winter are a gamble. Leather turn shoes were common, soft, flat, and about as waterproof as a sponge. If you had the coin, you might line them with wool or stuff them with straw. Socks, rare. If you did wear them, they were made of stitched cloth or felt, not knitted yet. Knitting doesn't really hit Europe until the later medieval period. So yes, your feet are cold. Always. Here's where things get interesting. Wealthy people had layers too, but theirs were a bit more extra. Think fur linings, fur cuffs, fur cloaks, squirrel, fox, even nerd ermine if you were particularly loaded. Some nobles wore garments so thickly lined with fur they could barely move their arms without knocking over a candlestick. These weren't just warm, they were status symbols. You weren't just surviving winter, you were conquering it with style and an overkill of dead animals. But even common folk found ways to be clever. Layering wasn't just about thickness, it was about material. Linen under wool made it easier to wash the inner layer and preserve the outer ones. Wool repelled water, so cloaks often doubled as makeshift umbrellas. Cloak pins were so valuable that losing one might trigger a full-on domestic crisis, and garments weren't just clothes, they were currency, dowry, inheritance. A well-made cloak might be passed down through generations, patched and re-dyed, until it was more history than fabric. Here's a quirky detail. Some cloaks were designed asymmetrically. One side was longer, to wrap over the shoulder and pin on the opposite side like a makeshift scarf. That extra material could be pulled over your face during storms or used to cover your hands when carrying firewood. Multi-purpose fashion. Nothing goes to waste. Now, there's a bit of debate among historians about just how layered people really were. Some argue that peasants didn't have enough spare clothing to layer up much at all, maybe 1 or 2 tunics at best. Others point out that even the poorest households prioritised warmth over all else, and would barter, trade or recycle materials endlessly to make another layer possible. The truth? Probably both. In wealthier regions or during prosperous years, even the poor had extra garments. During famines or hard winters, you wore what you had and froze. And let's not forget, cloaks and blankets were often interchangeable. At night, your cloak becomes your blanket. By day, your blanket becomes your coat. You get creative. Some folks even wrap themselves in old sailcloth or grain sacks. It wasn't about looking good, it was about not turning into a human icicle. You step outside now, properly layered, and instantly feel the difference. The wind still bites at your cheeks, your nose is running, and your toes are already numb, but you can move. You can breathe. You're not warm exactly, but you're armoured against the worst of it. And as you glance down the village path, you see others emerging from their homes, bundled, wrapped, and wobbling like wool-wrapped potatoes with legs. Some have scarves or neck wraps made from twisted rags. Others carry warming stones wrapped in cloth. More on that in a few sections. Everyone looks vaguely miserable, but no one complains. Complaining takes energy. Instead, you nod, sniff, and get to work. The cold will follow you all day, into the fields, into the barns, into the market. You'll carry it like a shadow, but your layers are your shield, your second skin, your medieval exoskeleton. And when the wind starts to howl and the sleet begins to fall, you'll hunch into your cloak, pull your hood tight, and keep walking, because you're dressed for it. Dressed not for fashion, but for war. The daily, grinding, icy war against winter. The first thing you notice when you walk into the barn isn't the smell, although, yes, it's definitely there. It's the warmth. Thick, musky, damp, and very much alive. You close the door behind you, and it's like stepping into a giant, living, snorting blanket. Welcome to the original space heater, livestock. Now, you may have imagined that people and animals stayed neatly in their separate places, like respectable roommates. But no, during the brutal months of winter, the lines blur. People didn't just house their animals in the barn. Sometimes, especially in smaller peasant homes, they housed them inside the living space. Not out of laziness or poor hygiene, but out of sheer practical necessity. Warmth was precious. And cows? Basically giant, flatulent radiators. Let's set the scene. You're in a 2-room cottage if you're lucky. The animals, goats, a few sheep, maybe a pig or a cow if you've got status, sleep in one end of the room, separated by a low wall or just a change in floor level. There's straw bedding for them, a feeding trough or two, and a whole lot of steam sizzling into the already smoke-choked air. The people sleep in the other part of the room, huddled together like we discussed, with the fire near the centre and not a single personal boundary in sight. And here's the wild thing, it actually works. The collective body heat of 2 or 3 cows can noticeably raise the temperature inside the home. Maybe not enough to make you strip down to your linen undershirt, but enough to keep the frost off your eyebrows. Even chickens, kept in baskets or coops near the hearth, added their feathered warmth to the mix. A pig might sleep beside you on the floor, snoring away and kicking straw across your blanket. It's not exactly cosy. The animals smell, they fart, they occasionally step on things, or you, but they're warm and they're part of the team now. They're family, at least until spring or the next feast day. You don't name them, of course. That would be unwise, but you might still whisper thanks when a cow snorts and steams up the room on a particularly vicious night. Some houses were designed with this integration in mind. In regions like Scandinavia, or the alpine villages, you'd find byre dwellings, structures where one half of the building was for humans and the other for animals. The heat from the livestock would rise, and if the family slept in a loft above, they'd benefit from the warmth. Yes, your bedroom smells like manure, but your toes aren't falling off. Call it a win. Now here's a lovely fringe fact to warm your heart and maybe your stomach. In some traditions, the animals were believed to speak on Christmas Eve. Yes, actual speech. It was thought that because they had shared the manger with the Christ child, they were granted the power of human language for that one holy night. Of course, no one ever claimed to hear them speak, because doing so was supposed to bring bad luck. But it was comforting in a way, to think of your cow as a silent, unsacred roommate with secret opinions about your snoring. But not everyone bought into this arrangement. Some wealthier households kept their animals entirely separate, in detached barns or sheds. That made things colder indoors, but cleaner, or rather, less disgusting. It's hard to maintain a decent floor when a goat keeps wandering through your kitchen. And then there's the noise. Mooing, clucking, stamping, squealing. You don't sleep through that. You survive it. Still, historians debate just how widespread this cohabitation really was. Some argue that animals in the house were only common in the poorest, coldest regions. Others say it was the norm for centuries across much of rural Europe. Archaeological remains of ancient floor plans show clear divisions, but also shared spaces. The lines weren't consistent. What is consistent is the medieval tendency to use every available heat source, no matter how hairy or loud. You run your hand along the flank of a cow now, and it's like touching a furnace. Her breath steams in the dim light, and you can feel the life radiating off her. She doesn't mind you. She's used to this. You toss her a handful of hay and shift a few steps away as she begins to chew, loudly, wetly, with no sense of timing, but she's warm. And that's all that matters. In some households, pigs were actually brought closer to the hearth, not just for heat, but for fattening. The warmth helped them grow faster, and it was easier to feed them when they were nearby. The downside, pigs are loud, really loud, and they scream like they're being murdered every time you step on their tail, which in a cramped one-room cottage happens more than you'd like. You're starting to notice something now, though. The cold isn't as bad as it was earlier. It's not gone, but it's manageable. Between the fire, the layers, the tightly packed sleeping arrangements, and the animal body heat, the house has become its own little ecosystem, a stew of smells, sounds, and steam. Not luxurious, but alive, vibrant in a weird, grungy way. You start to understand how people made it through the worst months, not by fighting the cold head-on, but by turning the house into a kind of shared biosphere. Human, animal, fire, all breathing, all enduring. Outside, the snow is falling again. You can hear the flakes against the wooden door, soft, steady, almost peaceful, but you stay inside. With your back against a goat and your feet near the hearth, you've found the warmest seat in the house. Just try not to think about what you're sitting in. Or what that squelch was. It's probably best not to know. You're up before the sun again, because someone has to keep the fire alive. And surprise, it's you. The others are still buried under blankets and cloaks, snoring into the woolly fog. But the hearth is your responsibility now. It's not glamorous. You don't get applause. But if those embers die, no one's getting warm porridge this morning, or dry socks, or anything resembling joy. So you creep out from under the blanket pile, shivering the instant you lose contact with the group. Your feet hit the dirt floor like two frozen potatoes. You wrap your cloak tighter, squat beside the hearth, and peer into the ashes with all the reverence of a priest facing the relics of a saint. Are the coals still glowing? You dig in gently with a stick, hoping, praying. A little puff of red winks back at you. Yes, still alive. Now comes the careful part, adding just enough dry tinder to wake the fire up without smothering it. Twigs, a twist of straw, maybe a shred of old linen if you're feeling generous. You blow softly, just enough to coax a flicker. Your face is so close you can smell the soot already clinging to your hair. Keeping a fire alive overnight isn't easy. You can't just toss on a log and walk away. Medieval wood burns fast, especially the soft, poorly seasoned stuff most peasants had access to. Oak, if you could get it, burned long and hot, but that was rare. Usually you made do with damp birch, pine, or whatever else the forest reluctantly offered. To keep the coals from going cold, you bank the fire at night. That means covering the embers with a layer of ash or turf to insulate them and slow their burn. It's a delicate art. Too much, then you smother the fire. Too little, and it burns out anyway. Either way, it's a gamble you lose by morning more often than you'd like. You get it going again, finally. The straw catches, then the twigs, then a stick. It crackles to life with a hiss and pop that feels more satisfying than a choir of angels. You sit back on your heels, exhaling through your nose, and watch the smoke curl up toward the thatch. Another fire, another day. You're not alone in this job. Firekeeping was often shared, though someone always ended up doing more than their fair share. Kids were roped in early, learning to strike flint, blow on embers, and not light the house on fire in the process. And elders too, those too old for hard labour, still had a role. Watching the fire, feeding it, coaxing warmth into the house. It's quiet work. Honourable, even. No one praises it, but everyone depends on it. Here's something interesting. In some parts of medieval Europe, firekeeping became a deeply symbolic act. In Celtic regions, for example, the hearth was sacred. The last person to touch the fire at night might say a prayer or recite a charm to protect the household while they slept. In monastic communities, specific monks were assigned to the fire as part of their holy duties. It wasn't just survival, it was the spiritual maintenance. You stretch your fingers toward the growing flame, letting the heat thaw the stiffness in your knuckles. You've got a few more minutes before the house starts to wake up, before people start shouting for porridge or asking if you saw the goat sneak in again. For now, it's just you and the fire. It crackles softly, warming the stones, the floor, your bones. You feel like a magician who's conjured the sun. But here's the fringe fact to twist your brain a little. Some medieval households shared fire with neighbours, literally. If your hearth went cold and you couldn't get a spark going, you'd send a child or servant running to borrow embers from someone else's home. They'd carry the coals in a clay pot wrapped in damp cloth, trying to keep it alive on the walk back. A sort of medieval Uber Eats, but for fire. There was even a term for this, borrowed fire. And it wasn't just about heat, it was a gesture of community. No one left you to freeze, not if they could help it. Still, historians debate how often fires truly went out. Some argue that a well-banked hearth could survive a full night with minimal attention. Others say fires went out all the time, especially during hard winters when wood was scarce and people rationed it to the splinter. Archaeological hearths often show layers of ash and charcoal in varying depths, proof of both careful maintenance and occasional failure. You get up now, joints cracking, and start feeding in the real fuel. No more twigs, it's time for logs. The woodpile is just outside the door, stacked under a lean-to keep it dry. Or at least that's the theory. It's damp, as always. You grab what you can carry and bring it inside, shaking snow off the bark. The fire accepts it grudgingly, hissing and smoking before finally catching. This is your morning routine. Every day, without fail, wake up, check the coals, relight the fire, breathe in smoke. Carry wood, try not to burn your sleeve off. It's as familiar to you as washing your face, assuming the water basin hasn't frozen solid, which it probably has. You sit by the fire again, your hands outstretched. You glance around at the sleeping forms still bundled together, the slowly warming room, the faint scent of smoke and damp wool hanging in the air. The sky outside is starting to lighten to a dull grey. Another day begins, and thanks to you, it won't begin frozen. No one will say thank you, but they'll feel it. In the warm floorboards, the hot porridge, the comfort of not waking up with frost clinging to their eyebrows. That's your work. Quiet, essential, thankless, you are the firekeeper, and in winter you are the reason anyone makes it to spring. You hear the crackle before you see it, the deep, satisfying roar of a fire that's not just functional, but luxurious. You step into the manor house, or maybe it's the newer wing of a castle, and there it is, a real full-size fireplace set into a stone wall with an actual chimney to carry the smoke up and out. No more smoke hole, no more crouching in a haze of ash. This is the heating revolution. Well, the early version of one. It hits you immediately. The air is clearer. Your lungs aren't itching. Your eyes don't water. You're not coughing every third breath. The fireplace has changed the game, even if it's only available to the elite. The flames dance behind an arched opening framed in carved stone or sometimes wood, with a hearth wide enough to roast a pig, or more commonly, warm a noble's dainty feet. The presence of a chimney, even a rudimentary one, is a sign of wealth. You look up and see the flue, the narrow shaft carved through the masonry that funnels smoke out of the building instead of letting it sit around like an awkward guest at a family dinner. This isn't just about comfort, it's about status. If your home has a chimney, it means you can afford the kind of structure that needs one. It means you have the option to not live like your livestock. Now, to be clear, chimneys weren't born in the Middle Ages. The Romans had early versions, but during most of the early medieval period, people went without. It wasn't until around the 12th century that chimneys started to become a common feature in the homes of the rich, and even then, they were slow to spread. Stonemasons had to figure out how to build them without collapsing walls, and fire safety was more theory than science. Early chimneys were wide, deep, sometimes so much so that a person could climb inside to clean them. You wouldn't want to, but you could, so who gets fireplaces? Nobles for sure, clergy, wealthy merchants in the later Middle Ages. You wander through a manor house and see them in the private chambers, the guest rooms, even some corridors. Small ones for sure, but they're everywhere. The kitchen has its own massive fireplace big enough to hold hanging pots, iron grates, maybe even a baking oven built into the side. But even these noble fireplaces didn't heat entire rooms. The heat stayed close to the flame. That's why everyone still sits with their backs turned to the fire and their faces frozen. You warm your shins and your spine's already turning to ice. The furniture is arranged accordingly. Benches along the wall for storage, chairs near the hearth for the privileged view, and wide canopies over beds to trap what little warmth the fire releases overnight. And speaking of beds, some of the richer households had fireplaces installed in their sleeping chambers. Yes, bedroom fireplaces, an unimaginable luxury for a peasant. These rooms were smaller, easier to heat. and the fire was sometimes kept burning through the night with the help of a servant whose sole job was to tend the flame while the master slept. Imagine being paid to stay up and watch a fire. Meanwhile, back in your village, you're doing that job for free, half frozen and completely unappreciated. Now here's a fringe fact that deserves a moment of spotlight. Medieval fireplaces weren't just for heat or cooking, they were also conversation pieces, literally. The wealthier families had the mantle and the surround carved with their coat of arms, family mottos, or even religious symbols. If you wanted to signal piety and financial success, there was no better way than having the Virgin Mary carved into your chimney breast above a roaring fire. But of course, nothing's ever perfect. With chimneys came problems. You see, drawing smoke upward, rather than letting it pool in a room, is wonderful. Unless the design is off, early chimneys often had terrible drafts. If the flue was too narrow, smoke backed up into the room. If it was too wide, all the heat vanished up the chimney like it was trying to escape your awkward dinner conversation. There were no dampers, no flue regulators, and no real understanding of airflow mechanics. You built it, hoped for the best, and if it smoked out the room, well, at least it looked expensive. Scholars still debate whether fireplaces actually improved heating efficiency in the early days. Sure, the air was clearer, but was the room warmer? Probably not by much. The open hearths in peasant homes, for all their smoke and soot, radiated heat all around the room. The early wall fireplaces, by contrast, focused heat in one direction, forward. They were excellent for warming your front while your back turned to stone, but efficiency wasn't the point. The point was prestige. This was the Middle Ages, after all. A fireplace was a way to show you'd made it, that you weren't like them, that your home didn't have a smoke hole full of birds nesting in it. Still, for all their shortcomings, fireplaces were game changers, but they eventually enabled multi-storey homes to have separate hearths on each floor. They allowed for the rise of private rooms, more autonomy, more comfort, and, over time, better designs. By the late Middle Ages, some homes had chimney stacks with multiple flues, serving different rooms and reducing smoke leakage. You could even close the flue to trap heat. Slowly, painfully, heating was getting smarter. Back in the room with the roaring fire, you feel your face flush with heat. It's dry, not steamy. The light flickers against the stone walls, and the air smells of wood smoke and beeswax polish instead of damp hay and unwashed tunics. This is warmth with style. You look around and see other people inching closer to the hearth, hands outstretched, smiling faintly. No one's coughing, no one's blinking through smoke. It's not just heat, it's peace. And then the fire dies down a little. One of the servants stirs from the corner, throws on a log, pokes the embers. The flames rise again, and you're reminded someone still has to tend it. Even in luxury, the fire must be fed, though there's no escaping that. You're sitting comfortably near the fire, or as comfortably as one can manage while wearing 3 layers of itchy wool when someone walks in carrying a small blackened pot of something. It smells earthy, a little smoky and sharp in a way that tickles the inside of your nose. You recognise it immediately. Charcoal. Not for drawing, not for fancy sketches of saints or devils. This stuff is for burning. And while it may look unassuming, it's about to become one of the most quietly dangerous heat sources in the medieval world. Charcoal, unlike regular firewood, burns hot, steady, and most importantly, clean. Yeah, not clean in a 21st century eco-certified way, but clean enough that it doesn't produce the same thick, billowing clouds of smoke as your average open hearth blaze. That made it extremely popular for indoor use, especially in enclosed spaces where you didn't necessarily want to turn your home into a fog machine every night. So, let's break this down. Charcoal is made by slowly heating wood in a low-oxygen environment, essentially cooking it until all the water, sap and volatile compounds are gone, leaving behind pure carbon. The result is a lightweight jet-black material that lights quickly, burns longer and emits less smoke. In an age where smoke inhalation was a regular feature of daily life, this was practically magic. But, here's the terrifying part, it also emits carbon monoxide. And medieval people had no clue. They'd take a clay brazier or metal pan, load it with glowing charcoal and bring it inside to warm a room, often placing it under a table draped with a heavy cloth or even under a bed. Cozy? Absolutely. Silent? Yes. Deadly? Sometimes. You can imagine how this played out. The room gets warmer. People stop shivering. They nod off, relieved to finally sleep without freezing their bones off. And then they don't wake up. Not every time, of course. but often enough that medieval texts and folktales began to warn against bringing the coals too close to the bed. They didn't understand carbon monoxide, but they knew something wasn't right. Still, the temptation was hard to resist. You've got a fuel source that burns without choking you with smoke. You can keep it contained in a portable device. You don't need a chimney, you don't even need a hearth. Just a metal pot, some glowing coals, and enough caution to not smother yourself in your sleep. A lot of trust, basically. Trust in your own judgment. Trust that the wind doesn't shift. Trust that you're not falling asleep forever. And it wasn't just homes using charcoal. Blacksmiths swore by it. Monasteries sometimes used it in braziers to warm their study rooms or scriptoria during long nights of copying texts. Nobles used it in ornate foot warmers and hand warmers, like tiny portable toasters that could be tucked into carriages, under tables, or even into specially designed furniture. One particularly fascinating use was in the kotatsu setup, a Japanese innovation that eventually had its medieval European cousins. Imagine a low table with a brazier underneath and a heavy cloth draped over it. Everyone sits with their legs under the cloth, letting the heat rise into a kind of shared microclimate. It's intimate, warm, and yes, occasionally tragic if someone forgets to open a window. Now, the charcoal itself wasn't something you could just whip up in the backyard. It took skill to produce. Charcoal burners, yes, that was a real profession, would stack wood into elaborate piles, cover them with turf or clay, and then burn them slowly over several days. They lived rough, often in huts deep in the forest, tending their piles, fending off thieves, and trying not to choke on fumes. It was dirty, dangerous work, but it paid. Charcoal was a hot commodity, pun absolutely intended, especially in colder regions or places with limited firewood. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Charcoal burners were often regarded as mysterious or even slightly cursed figures. Living alone in the woods, always covered in soot, handling fire for a living, it gave them an air of magic, or at least deep weirdness. In some folktales, they're half sorcerer, half recluse. The man who brings fire from the forest and disappears before spring. But not all charcoal experiences ended in tragedy. In well-ventilated rooms, with careful management, charcoal could offer a safer, longer-lasting source of heat than traditional logs. And it had a unique benefit. It didn't pop or crackle. That made it ideal for monasteries and libraries where silence was sacred. Imagine sitting in a cold stone room, reading by candlelight, your feet warmed by a brazier that glows softly beneath the desk. No smoke, no sparks, just gentle heat and the scratch of quills on parchment. Of course, there's still debate among historians about how widespread charcoal heating actually was in domestic life. Some believe it was reserved mostly for the wealthy in institutional settings due to cost and production limits. Others argue that in colder regions, especially mountainous ones where trees were scarcer and fires had to be managed carefully, charcoal was the norm. Evidence from preserved hearths, scorched pottery, and even medieval literature suggests that it was at least common enough to leave a mark, sometimes literally, in the form of carbon stains in stone hearths and flue linings. You look at the brazier now, glowing quietly in the corner of the room, and it's hard not to appreciate its simplicity. No need to crouch and poke at it constantly, no logs to haul in, just a steady, controlled warmth that feels like the future, even if it's a little spooky. You shift closer, holding out your hands. The heat wraps around your fingers like a breath, gentle and constant. Someone throws a cloak over the brazier and rests their feet near it, sighing deeply. You watch, momentarily jealous, and wonder if maybe you could get one of these in your own little cottage. Probably not, but it's nice to imagine. A warm corner, a cloth over your legs, and a heat source that doesn't blind you with smoke or leave your clothes smelling like disappointment. Charcoal, beautiful, efficient, slightly cursed, just like everything else in the Middle Ages. You've just climbed into bed, or at least the medieval approximation of one. It's a wooden frame packed with straw, maybe some hay, maybe some dried reeds if you're fancy. A layer of rough cloth separates you from the sharpest bits, and you've got a few wool blankets, a moth-eaten cloak, and the lingering warmth of whatever body just vacated the space before you. You wiggle your feet under the covers and quickly discover they're as cold and stiff as 2 chunks of frozen cheese. Now's the time for some real ingenuity. You reach to the side of the bed and grab it, a hot stone wrapped in fabric, heavy, a little damp from condensation, and still radiating heat like a loyal companion. You slide it under the blanket and immediately follow it with your freezing feet. Bliss. The medieval version of a heated mattress pad, except it smells faintly of smoke and probably cracked at least one toenail last winter. Welcome to the wonderfully specific world of hot stones, hot bricks, and bed warmers, the unsung heroes of bedtime survival during medieval winters. These weren't some rare luxury either. Almost everyone who could manage it used them in some form. After all, once the fire dies down, the house gets cold fast. And climbing into a cold bed is one thing. Staying there all night without turning into a human icicle is another. Let's start with hot stones. You'd take a medium-sized rock, nothing too porous, nothing that explodes when heated, and place it near the fire for a good long while, letting it absorb as much heat as possible. Once it was hot to the touch, but not glowing, you'd wrap it in cloth or place it in a wooden or ceramic container, then tuck it into the bed before climbing in. Sometimes it was placed at the foot of the bed, sometimes the middle. If you were clever, you had more than one, and if you were rich, you upgraded to the bed warmer. Imagine a metal pan with a long handle filled with glowing embers, swung gently between the sheets to warm the bed before you got in. It's part heating device, part fire hazard, and all the rage among wealthier households. Servants were usually the ones responsible for this, carefully running the pan between the linens without scorching the fabric or setting the mattress ablaze. It was an art, a terrifying, flammable art. You've probably already guessed the obvious problem. Embers in a metal pan swishing around near hay and wood. Fires happened. Whole houses went up in smoke because someone got a little too enthusiastic with the bed warmer or fell asleep too soon after using it. Fire safety wasn't exactly part of the training program. You'd just get a firm warning and maybe a haunted look from someone who'd lost a cousin to the Great Blanket Fire of 1187 that is. Still, people kept using them. Why? Because they worked. If you've ever climbed into a warm bed after a cold day, you know, your muscles unclench, your breath steadies, you sleep better. In the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just comfort, it was recovery. Physical warmth led to literal survival. But bed warmers didn't just stop at stones and pans. Some homes used bottles, stoneware or earthenware jugs filled with hot water and corked tight. The precursor to the modern hot water bottle. These were less risky and more reusable. Heat the water over the fire, pour it into the jug and snuggle up with it under the covers. A peasant family might only have one, passed around like a sacred relic from person to person. Children fought over it. Adults pretended not to. It was the medieval equivalent of winning the pillow lottery. Here's a detail you didn't know you needed. Some jugs were shaped to fit between your feet, curved, narrow-necked, and sealed with wax or cloth. These weren't just functional, they were designed with care. In fact, archaeological digs have turned up examples of these heated vessels, often with scorch marks near the base and tiny cracks from centuries of thermal shock. They were well loved, sometimes too well loved. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In colder parts of Europe, some beds were designed as box beds, enclosed on all sides with wood panels and sometimes even a sliding door. That alone helped trap the body heat. But add a few hot stones under a thick wool cover, and suddenly you've got the closest thing to a sauna you're going to find in 1342. Box beds were especially common in Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, places where the cold laughed at your cloak and danced through your floorboards. It wasn't just for warmth, though. These enclosed beds also offered privacy in a one-room home, and a sort of acoustic barrier against snoring neighbours, squealing pigs, and midnight windstorms. Now, some historians argue that these heat retention methods were less common among the poorest families. After all, if you only have one blanket, chances are you're not juggling a hot jug of water too. But others point to evidence: burn marks in hearthstone floors, fragments of scorched ceramics, and surviving folk traditions that suggest hot stones and warmers were pretty widespread. Not glamorous, not carved with heraldry, but common, practical. You roll over in your straw mattress, pulling the warm stone closer to your belly. It's still holding a bit of heat even after an hour. Your feet are no longer frozen. The fire's glow from the hearth has faded, but your bed is its own little pocket of comfort now, a bubble of survivable temperature in a house that's barely above freezing. And as you drift off, wrapped in scratchy wool, surrounded by creaking wood, snoring family, and the occasional grumble from the pig in the corner, you think, maybe we don't give medieval people enough credit. They didn't have thermostats, but they had fire, and hot bricks, and clever little ways to carry warmth from the flames to their bones, even if it meant burning their shins once or twice. You're back on the cold stone floor of a monastery now, trailing silently behind a group of monks in heavy robes. Their sandals scuff the frost-dusted corridor, their breath visible in the chilly morning light seeping through narrow, arched windows. Everything is quiet except for the distant echo of bells and the occasional cough. A reminder that no amount of holiness can protect your lungs from medieval winter. But as you walk, something odd happens. The air shifts just a little. It's warmer here. Not warm exactly, but noticeably less frigid. You glance down at the floor, and that's when you realise it's warm beneath your feet. Congratulations, you've just stumbled into one of the rarest and most impressive feats of medieval architecture, underfloor heating, or as the Romans used to call it, the hypocaust. And yes, even in the Middle Ages a few clever folks kept the idea alive, long after the Roman Empire fell like a stone cake. Here's how it works. Beneath the stone floor you're standing on is a system of chambers, low, brick tunnels that allow warm air to circulate under the surface. Fires are built at one end, in a small furnace chamber called a praefurnium. The hot air flows through the space beneath the floor, sometimes rising through hollow bricks built into the walls, gradually heating the room from below. It's the closest thing the medieval world had to central heating, and when done right it could warm even large rooms with surprising consistency, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. This wasn't something you'd find in every little village hut, or even in most castles. Hypocaust systems were rare, expensive, and required constant tending. Monasteries, particularly the wealthier ones, were among the few places that could afford to build and maintain them. Not for luxury, of course, but for purpose. The monks had to work, pray, study, and copy text through long, frozen months. You can't produce neat calligraphy when your fingers are purple and shaking. The scriptorium, the sacred room where monks copied illuminated manuscripts, was often one of the warmest places in a well-endowed abbey. If any space got special heating, it was this one. Think about it. You're trying to draw delicate vines and gold-leaf angels in a book the size of a small child, using a quill and ink that freezes if you pause too long. You need steady hands, you need light, and you need heat. You crouch beside one of the wall vents and feel the faint breath of warm air drifting upward. Someone down below, maybe a lay brother, is feeding the furnace, keeping the hypocaust alive. It's hard work. The fires have to be kept burning for hours, and the smoke must be carefully directed away through flues and vents. You can't let ash clog the channels or you risk suffocating everyone in their sleep. Again, this technology wasn't new. The Romans mastered it centuries before, heating their villas, bathhouses, and military outposts with sprawling hypocaust systems. After Rome fell, much of that knowledge vanished, or was considered too costly or impractical for the rougher realities of medieval Europe. But in places where old Roman ruins still stood, especially in Britain, France, and parts of Germany, clever masons and monks began to imitate or even repurpose the old systems. Some monasteries built right on top of Roman remains, using their hypocausts and adding their own tweaks. Others built new ones from scratch, though far more rudimentary. These weren't grand spas or luxury chambers. They were functional, modest, and hidden beneath cold stone walls. But in a world where warmth was rare, they were close to sacred. Here's a strange side note. Some monasteries reportedly had heated lavatoriums. That's a fancy word for washrooms. Not because monks were pampered, but because frozen water doesn't clean much. And frozen monks clean even less. So they funneled heat toward these areas in winter, not to spoil themselves, but to preserve hygiene and routine, medieval comfort, always tied to duty tour. The debate among scholars comes here. Just how many hypocaust systems actually survived into the medieval period? Some believe they were virtually extinct by the time Charlemagne showed up. Others argue they persisted quietly in religious institutions, noble estates and urban bathhouses longer than we think. The challenge is that many of the systems were rebuilt, expanded, or buried under later renovations, making it hard to date them precisely. But there's no doubt some version of underfloor heating existed in select places. Enough written records, archaeological evidence, and architectural clues point to this being more than myth. And beyond that, it shows a fundamental truth. Even in the darkest centuries, people remembered warmth. They sought it, recreated it, modified it, carried Roman ideas like fire in their hands, protecting them through the long winter of history. Back in the monastery, the warmth underfoot starts to fade as you walk toward the unheated end of the building. Your breath fogs again, your joints stiffen. You pull your robe tighter, joining the others now gathering in the refectory, the dining hall. It's colder here. The walls are high, the fire small, and the stone benches unforgiving. The monks eat in silence, faces stoic, spoons clinking against wooden bowls. But beneath the floor, A quiet current of heat still flows from the scriptorium, a leftover kindness, a reminder. Here's your quirky medieval detail of the night. In some places, heated floors weren't just practical, they were political. Certain monastic orders used them to show their wealth and influence. If your abbey could afford warmth in winter, you'd likely gain more recruits, more donations, and more regional clout. It wasn't bragging exactly, but it was a flex. Come freeze with the other monks, the poorer monasteries might say. Or come here, where we warm your feet and your old soul. You step back outside now onto frost-hardened ground. The wind slices across your face like it's annoyed at being ignored. But for a moment, you smile. Somewhere behind those walls, a fire is still burning. Hidden, efficient, quiet. A legacy of forgotten empires, devout scribes and people who knew that comfort, even in small doses, was worth fighting for. It may not have reached the peasantry or even most castles, but underfloor heating existed, and it's kept the light and the warmth alive. You're standing in front of a window, or what passes for one in the Middle Ages. It's not made of glass, because glass is something only cathedrals and kings can afford in this era. No, this particular window is covered with a stretched piece of parchment. Animal hide, to be specific. Thin, scraped, and treated with oil until it's translucent enough to let in light, but thick enough to keep out most of the wind. It glows faintly amber in the winter sun, like a dirty lampshade. And yes, it smells faintly of goat. So let's talk about windows, or rather, the cold medieval lack thereof. You might think of windows as a given in architecture, an essential ingredient of indoors, but in the average medieval home, a window wasn't a clear view of your garden. It was a hole in the wall, literally, a shuttered gap to let in light. Sometimes air, sometimes birds if you forgot to close it, and almost always cold. If you're poor, and let's face it, you probably are, your house has one or two small windows, just big enough to keep you from cooking in darkness. They don't have glass. Maybe, say, they have a wooden shutter you can latch from the inside. Or maybe you've stretched some oiled linen or animal bladder across the opening in a desperate attempt to block the wind. It works, kind of, until it dries out cracks. Or a curious chicken pokes a hole in it with its beak. Now, if you're a bit better off or live in a monastic or urban dwelling, you might have a pane of horn. Yes, horn. Cow or ox horn, sliced thin, boiled, scraped, and flattened into cloudy sheets. It lets in light and blocks the wind, but you're not seeing any picturesque vistas through it. It's like living behind fogged-up bathroom glass forever. But still, it's a step up from letting the air scream through open holes all winter. Glass windows do exist, but not for you. They're rare, expensive, handmade, and labour-intensive. Each tiny pane is blown cut and leaded into a lattice of strips. Even in castles, you only find glass in the grandest rooms, and even then, it's often removed in winter to prevent cracking from the cold or storm damage. It's not like today's double-glazed, climate-controlled panels. Medieval glass is thin, brittle, wavy, and full of imperfections. Beautiful in a chapel, pointless in a storm. Here's where things get interesting. In northern climates, people learn to use shutters as insulation tools. Thick wooden panels, sometimes lined with wool or stuffed with straw, were closed at night to trap in warmth. Some clever households even used curtains, not just over beds, but over entire window frames. Heavy cloths hung from rods or pegs, pulled aside during the day and dropped at dusk. It's primitive thermal management, medieval drapery as survival strategy. Still, no matter what material covered your window, it didn't change the reality. Windows were cold spots. Heat bled out through them like blood from a wound. You could hang 3 layers of cloth and still feel the draft sneaking in at the corners. In wealthier homes, the solution was to reduce the number of windows entirely. Large halls often had a few high, narrow slits, impossible to see through, easy to defend, and very hard for the wind to crawl through. And now for your niche, mildly cursed medieval fact. In some particularly desperate cases, people sealed their windows for the entire winter. Literally boarded them up. No light, no air, just darkness, warmth, and a growing sense of cave-dwelling dread. It wasn't ideal for mental health or for lungs already full of smoke, but it did help trap heat. And if you were low on fuel or running short on blankets, that bit of extra insulation might be the difference between a rough winter and a fatal one. You run your fingers along the edge of the shutter now, feeling the roughness of the wood, the cold seeping through like it's testing you. You crack it open just an inch, and instantly the wind barges in like a drunk relative at a feast. Loud, bitter, and full of opinions. You slam it shut again and latch it. You've learned your lesson. Outside is for fools and livestock. Meanwhile, in more sophisticated settings, say a cathedral cloister or a noble's solar, you might encounter mullioned windows, stone-divided arches with tiny panes of horn or glass set in lead frames. They're beautiful, yes, but practical, not really. They leak, they rattle, they let in the cold like it's a guest with its own seat at the table. Some rooms even had interior shutters in addition to exterior ones, a double layer, like putting on 2 coats indoors, because why not? There's still some historical debate over how often the average household used these coverings, and how much they helped. Written records are spotty. Art tends to exaggerate the beauty of homes, and surviving structures have been heavily renovated. But the consensus is clear: people adapted, whether with horn, hide, cloth, or straight-up wood. They did what they could to block the cold without completely sealing themselves in like root vegetables. You notice now that even when windows are present, people arrange their lives away from them in winter. The bed is never near the window. The fire is never beneath it. The animals are always far from it. You might hang a dried herb bundle over the frame to ward off drafts, or spirits, depending on who you ask. But no one truly trusts a window in winter. It's a weak point, a necessary evil, light in exchange for cold. And here's a little sensory bonus. Windows, whatever they're made of, sound different in winter. The stretched hide creaks when it tightens in the cold. The wooden shutters knock in the wind. The horn pane buzzes faintly if the wind hits it right. It's a constant reminder that your barrier against the world is thin, fragile, and possibly one chicken peck away from total failure. But still the sun filters through in the morning, dim, gold-grey, and slow. It casts soft light on the floor, enough to see by, enough to begin another day. You walk past the shuttered window, feel the cold radiating off it like a second moon, and pull your cloak tighter. It's not perfect, it's not pretty, but it's something. A small patch of light in a season built from shadows and smoke. A hole in the wall that says, "We're still here." You make your way through the back door of the house, stepping into the one room that's always warm, even in the dead of winter, the kitchen, or, if we're being honest, the kitchen corner, the hearthside nook, or whatever chunk of your medieval dwelling has been claimed by pots, ashes, and the sharp scent of boiled leeks. No matter what your home looks like, whether it's a peasant's hovel, a merchant's townhouse, or a noble's manor, the kitchen is your furnace, your centre of gravity, and your survival bunker. The fire here doesn't die, it can't. It's the place where food is cooked, water is boiled, medicines are brewed, and hands are thawed after too long in the snow. In fact, for many medieval homes, the kitchen is the only place that stays consistently warm throughout the year. Not because it's insulated, but because the fire rarely goes out. Even when it's not cooking, it's smouldering. Even when no one's near it, it's working. You crouch beside the hearth, where the coals glow like sleeping animals and soot clings to every surface. The fire is wider here than the narrow bed warmers and family room hearths, built for utility, not ambience. Iron hooks hang from a beam overhead, ready to swing cauldrons over the flame. A stone oven might be tucked into the side, and copper kettles line the wall, each of them blackened from years of use. This place feels like work, and that's what makes it precious. The heat comes with purpose, Bum, and in the middle of winter, when everything else is frozen, your windows, your fingers, your livestock's drinking water, the kitchen is the place where things still happen. Stew still simmers, bread still rises, babies are still born. You think that's a joke? Not even close. In poor homes, the hearth doubled as a birthing spot because it was the warmest place available. The fire didn't just cook your food, it kept you alive at your most vulnerable. This is also where people gather, not for leisure necessarily, but out of instinct. The body knows where the heat is. In a noble household, the scullery maids and kitchen boys practically live here during the winter. Not that they're relaxing, they're chopping, stirring, hauling and burning their fingers, but at least they're warm while doing it. And in a peasant home, when the rest of the family is scattered to the cold corners of the house, everyone slowly drifts back here. Even the cat, especially the cat. But don't romanticize it too much. This warmth comes at a cost. Kitchens are filthy. The floor is a minefield of grease, bones, broken pottery and soot. The air is always smoky. If you're the one tending the fire, you sweat even in January. Your hands are cracked from washing, your eyes sting from the smoke, and you've probably burned off your eyebrows more than once lighting the oven. But you'd still choose this over freezing in the hall with cold porridge and colder feet. Here's where things get surprisingly advanced. In better equipped homes, wealthy urban mamluk houses or monastic kitchens, you'll find built-in features that make fire management more efficient. Brick ovens with adjustable vents, smoke hoods to funnel exhaust out, sort of. Movable iron trivets for pot control, rotating spits turned by hand or in some cases by dogs running in wheels like a furry treadmill. Yes, turn-spit dogs were a real thing. Small muscular pups trained to run inside a wooden wheel, which turned a spit roasting meat over the fire. Their reward? Warmth, and sometimes a scrap of the roast they helped cook. But not all kitchens are inside. In many peasant homes, the cooking fire was kept in a lean-to or separate structure. Why? Because fire is dangerous, and medieval houses are basically kindling. A stray ember in the wrong breeze could burn down your home, your neighbours, and the church if you're having a particularly unlucky Tuesday. So for safety and often smoke management, the cooking fire stayed just outside, even in snow. Imagine standing over a pot in a sleet storm, trying to stir stew while your fingers go numb. Not ideal, but safer. In winter though, rules bend. People move the kitchen fire indoors, especially at night, or at least they bring the cooking indoors, warming gruel over the coals in the main room, using flat stones as makeshift stoves and burning whatever they have left, peat, twigs, even dung. It smells terrible, but it works. Here's the fringe detail. Some medieval households had a hearth hierarchy. The main cooking fire was sacred. Not spiritually, though sometimes yes, but practically, you didn't mess with it. Kids weren't allowed to play near it. Neighbours couldn't borrow embers from it unless explicitly invited. There were rules, and woe to the guest who stirred someone else's pot without asking. That's how you end up with stew in your lap and a very cold walk home. Now let's throw in a little scholarly debate. Was the kitchen really the warmest place in all medieval homes? Or is that just a modern assumption, filtered through our obsession with the hearth as a symbol of coziness? Some argue that large kitchens, especially in castles, were so big and drafty that even the giant fires couldn't fully warm them. Others point to design details, low ceilings in cottage kitchens, corner hearths, brick enclosures, that made these spaces efficiently warm even with minimal fuel. It likely depended on class, region, and how many people were willing to huddle in a 5-foot radius around the stew pot. You're still sitting there, your toes slowly regaining feeling, watching steam rise from a pot thick with root vegetables and yesterday's bread. Someone drops in a pinch of salt with the drama of a magician. A child tugs at their mother's apron and gets shooed toward the fire, where they curl up with their hands out, silent content. There's no real privacy here. No chairs even. Just benches, crates, the occasional stump. But it's warm, the only place where winter doesn't win. Eventually the bread is done. Someone slices it with a blade that's older than most of your family. It's crusty, chewy, hot enough to burn your fingers. You blow on it, chew slowly, and feel that rare sensation. Warmth on the inside. Heat from the fire, yes, but also from food that fills your stomach, from the company, from the rhythm of a room that's always in motion. In the Middle Ages, the kitchen isn't just where food is made. It's where survival simmers, one pot at a time. It's been another day of slogging through frozen mud, hauling buckets, and trying not to lose a toe to frostbite. Your cloak is stiff from sleet. Your bones ache like they've been individually cursed. The cottage fire is down to embers, and the idea of spending another night in a room full of snoring relatives and a goat with digestive issues is, let's say, unappealing. So instead, you head somewhere better. Warmer, louder, full of smoke and stories. You head to the tavern. Let's get one thing straight. The medieval tavern isn't a cosy pub with a menu chalkboard and rustic decor. It's loud, it's gritty, it smells like spilled ale, sweat, wet wool and a touch of horse, but it has what matters most, a fire, not a dainty little hearth tucked into a quiet corner either. A roaring central blaze meant to heat a room full of half-drunk, half-frozen townsfolk who've had it up to here with winter. You push open the heavy wooden door and warmth hits you. Your cheeks tingle as your skin begins to thaw. The fire sits in the middle of the room, surrounded by benches, stools, and a few people so close to the flames you're surprised they're not on fire. You find a spot nearby, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, and stretch out your hands like every other creature in the room. You've all come here for the same reason, not to drink, not to gossip, but to survive the cold together. Taverns, inns, alehouses, whatever the name, were more than just places to get drunk. In winter, they became community furnaces. The wealthy had their bed warmers and charcoal braziers. You had beer, body heat, and a fire the size of a coffin. And maybe, if the innkeeper was kind and the firewood plentiful, you could stay a while. Now, let's set the scene. The ceiling is low, blackened with soot. The air is thick with smoke. No chimney here. Just a hooded vent or maybe an opening in the roof that does just enough to keep your lungs guessing. Candles flicker on the tables. Dogs sleep underfoot, warming themselves on spilled broth and discarded bones. Someone in the corner is playing a lute badly. It's the opposite of elegant, but it's alive. Inns and taverns were also one of the few places where people from all walks of life might mingle, especially in winter. A merchant stops in to escape the icy road. A travelling friar warms his toes beside a thief who probably picked someone's pocket an hour ago. You're just grateful the bench isn't frozen. These public spaces weren't built with comfort in mind. There were no individual fireplaces for each room. Often there was just one main fire, and that's where everyone gathered, locals and travellers alike. In larger inns, you might find a second fire in the kitchen, or even a small brazier brought to a sleeping area. But those were the exception. If you wanted heat, you stayed in the common room. And sleeping arrangements. Oh, let's talk about that. Unless you were wealthy or had serious pull with the innkeeper, you didn't get your own room, or your own bed, or your own blanket sometimes. You shared. Strangers piled into shared spaces, warming each other the same way families did back home, by default, not by choice. The bed was a mattress on the floor, maybe stuffed with straw, or it was a bench, or it was just the floor, period. One side toward the fire, the other side freezing. Rotate every hour. No complaints allowed. Here's your fringe fact. In some towns, local ordinances required taverns to keep fires burning during the coldest months, not just for paying guests, but as a public service. These weren't just bars. They were hearth hubs, the medieval version of warming shelters. Travellers too broke for a bed could still sit near the fire, sip a cheap ale. And not die of hypothermia. A low bar for hospitality, but an important one. And it wasn't just about physical heat. Taverns were where people exchanged information, weather updates, harvest rumours, gossip about who froze their toes off in the next village over. In winter, when work slowed and nights stretched on forever, this was where you found out if the world still existed outside your field or farm. It was warmth and news, fire and narrative. But here's where things get dicey. Fire in public spaces was a double-edged sword, literally and figuratively. A stray ember, a tipped jug of oil, one too drunk traveller collapsing into the hearth, and suddenly the warmest place in town is a screaming inferno. Medieval towns were notorious for fires that wiped out entire blocks, especially in winter, when open flames were everywhere and dry timbers burned like angry kindling. Some towns passed fire safety laws, others just crossed their fingers and hoped the snow would help. Scholars still argue how widespread tavern culture really was among the poorest classes. Some believe the idea of nightly visits to the local alehouse is over-romanticised. After all, many peasants couldn't afford the drink, much less the time. Others point to records of fines, fights, and feasts to show that even the lowliest farmer found their way to a warm bench now and then. Reality probably sits somewhere in the middle. Maybe you didn't go every night, but when the cold became unbearable, the fire in the tavern called to you like a lighthouse in a frozen sea. You look around now, faces illuminated by flame, hands clasped around clay mugs. Someone laughs, someone snores, someone tells a story about a demon that sneaks into cottages through the smoke hole and steals firewood. No one believes it, but everyone nods, because in winter the fire feels like magic. And the place that holds the fire feels like a temple. Eventually the innkeeper gives you a nod, a silent permission to stay the night. No bed, just a spot on the floor near the hearth. You take it gladly, wrap yourself in your cloak, and let the fire do the rest. Outside the wind howls, but in here it's quiet, warm, bearable, and sometimes that's all you need. You wake to the sound of someone stirring a pot, a thin metal ladle scraping the sides like a church bell underwater. Your back aches from the hard tavern floor. Your mouth tastes like a medieval brewery exploded in your sleep, and your hands are too stiff to untie your cloak. Still, you smell something good, something hot. And if there's one thing more powerful than a fire on a winter morning, it's food, not just for flavour, but for heat. See, when the outside world is made of frost and the inside of your house is only slightly warmer than a cave, your body becomes your last heating device. And to keep that device running, you need fuel. Hearty, fatty, caloric fuel. The kind of food that doesn't just feed you, it fortifies you from the inside out. You don't eat to live, you eat to keep the cold from winning. The bowl that gets handed to you is filled with something brown, thick, and vaguely menacing. It's porridge. Or gruel, or pottage. The words change depending on your dialect, but the principle remains. Boil something starchy until it can't fight back, then eat it before it cools. Oats, barley, beans, lentils, sometimes even turnips or old cabbage, boiled together with a hunk of lard or whatever meat the cook remembered to throw in. It's not glamorous, but it warms your belly like a tiny edible hearth. In winter, every meal becomes an act of resistance. You need calories to stay warm. Fat especially becomes essential. Butter, suet, animal fat. These are your best friends now if you can get them. Poor households scrape every bit of fat from cooked meat and save it for bread, stew, or a desperately needed spoonful to stir into boiling grain. It adds richness, yes, but also insulation, truly. Fat slows digestion, boosts energy, and helps your body stay warm longer. It's biology meets desperation. And meat? Well, you don't eat it every day unless you're rich or dishonest. But in winter it takes centre stage. Salted pork, dried sausages, smoked fish, preserved to last through the barren months. It's chewy, salty, often suspiciously tough, but it delivers the protein and fat your body craves. On feast days, you might even get fresh meat, roasted over the hearth until the fat drips and sizzles. That's not just dinner, that's hope in edible form. Now let's not forget ale, not just for the merrymaking, but for warmth. Ale is calories in liquid form. It's safe, safer than most water, it provides energy, and the alcohol gives you that faint, misleading glow of warmth, tricking your brain into thinking you're not freezing. Everyone drinks it, men, women, children. Low alcohol small ale is a staple of the medieval diet, especially when it's cold. Add mulled wine to the picture, or spiced ale heated gently by the fire. And suddenly your evening feels less like survival and more like celebration. Here's a surprisingly advanced touch. Spices. If you have access to the trade routes, or just happen to work in a monastery or noble household, you might get pepper, cinnamon, or cloves in your food. Not a lot. Just enough to make your stew feel expensive and your blood feel a degree warmer. Some believed spices had medicinal warming properties. Others just liked the taste. Either way, they became a kind of edible status symbol. A way of saying, yes, it's snowing, but this pottage has nutmeg. Of course, not everyone has this kind of access. If you're a peasant scraping through the winter on last year's barley and cabbage, your meals are often the same thing every day. Mush in the morning, thicker mush at night, bread when you're lucky, ale when you're not. Still, there's something deeply comforting about the ritual of it. The routine, the way people gather around the pot, share what little they have, and wait for that first spoonful to thaw them from the inside. And don't overlook bread. Not the fluffy golden loaves we imagine when we hear the word. This bread is dense, dark, often gritty with leftover bran, or even wood ash from flour milled on dirty stones. But it fills the stomach, especially when dipped in stew or toasted by the fire. In some places, people made trencher bread, thick slabs used as edible plates. By the end of the meal, the bread is soaked with broth, softened by heat and ready to eat. Again, not just food, but function, warmth on a stick. Let's toss in your quirky fact for the night. Some folks swore by garlic soup as a winter cure-all. Made by boiling garlic with stale bread, water and sometimes a bit of oil, it was considered both food and medicine. Pungent enough to clear your sinuses and possibly kill vampires, it was eaten hot and fast and in some households considered a necessary winter staple. Whether it helped fight illness or just made you so smelly the cold refused to touch you is still up for debate. Now, historians have long argued whether the medieval diet was sufficient during the winter months. Some point to high rates of illness and malnutrition as evidence that people struggled to get enough calories. Others argue that the medieval diet, while repetitive, was surprisingly robust, especially when communities worked together to share resources and preserve food. Monasteries and manorial estates had systems in place for grain storage, salting meat and brewing ale year-round. So while flavour was often sacrificed, function was not. You glance around now at your fellow diners, some hunched over the bowls, others chewing slowly, steam rising from their meals and noses alike. The fire crackles behind you, but it's the food doing the real work. You feel the heat sink into your chest, spread through your limbs, your cheeks flush, your fingers loosen. You're not just fed, you're heated. Eventually the pot will empty, the fire will dim, people will shuffle off to bed or bench, wrapping their cloaks around themselves like burritos. But for now, this meal is enough. A warm belly and a cold world. A few bites of sustenance turned into an armour of calories and heat. You're ready to face the cold again, or at least not die in your sleep. The door swings open with a creak and a whoosh of warm, damp air that fogs your cold, reddened face like a kiss from a sauna. You step into a room that feels otherworldly, not because it's luxurious, but because it's not freezing. The air smells like hot water, damp towels, fermented herbs, and maybe a hint of sweat and scandal. Welcome to one of the most unusual, controversial, and weirdly intimate spaces of the medieval winter landscape. The public bathhouse. Now hold your judgment. You're not walking into a Roman marble palace or a Turkish steam fantasy. You're walking into something far more chaotic. A place where hygiene, gossip, medicine, sex, and religious anxiety all soak together in the one steamy, slippery room. But more importantly, it's warm. Warm like nothing else in your medieval life. The bathhouse was one of the few places where heat wasn't just a luxury. It was the entire point. Bathhouses didn't die with Rome. That's a modern myth. In fact, medieval Europe, especially from the 12th to 15th centuries, had a surprisingly active bath culture. Cities like Paris, London, Prague, and Nuremberg had dozens of public bathhouses, many of which operated year-round and in winter. Business boomed, because when the temperature dropped, people didn't just want to be clean, they wanted to thaw. You glance around the room, steam clinging to every timber beam and human surface. The bathhouse is often a simple structure, a large heated room with a central tub or several smaller basins, benches lining the walls, buckets of hot water stacked nearby. Beneath it all is the source of magic. A fire roaring beneath a stone or brick furnace, heating a tank of water and sometimes the floor itself. Bathhouses were basically giant kettles with a door, and the warmth doesn't stop at the water. The walls sweat, the air buzzes, even the wooden seats feel like they've been baking under a sun lamp. You strip off your layers, awkwardly, because getting out of 4 wool tunics and a crusty linen shirt isn't exactly a graceful act, and sink into the water. Instantly your body remembers what comfort feels like. The cold in your joints melts. Your fingers regain sensation. You might actually weep. No one would blame you. Now let's talk logistics. Bathhouses weren't always segregated in many medieval cities. Especially in the early and high Middle Ages, mixed gender bathing was completely normal. Men and women soaked together, sometimes nude, sometimes wrapped in bathing sheets, sometimes not caring either way. It was social, it was practical, it was complicated, because while some saw bathhouses as places of purification, others saw them as moral danger zones with too many elbows and not enough chastity. Enter the church. By the later Middle Ages, religious authorities began cracking down on public bathing, especially the mixed kind. Bathhouses were increasingly blamed for immorality, disease, and sinful thoughts, though it's worth noting that many monks and clergy continued to enjoy a hot soak when given the chance. Hypocrisy, thy name is steamy tub. Still, people loved their bathhouses, especially in winter. For many, it was the only time they'd be truly warm all week. And it wasn't just about the soak. Most bathhouses offered food and drink, mulled wine, warm ale, maybe some bread or roasted meat. Some even had musicians. You could spend the evening bathing, eating, and gossiping in your own little human broth. Here's your fringe fact. In some places, barbers worked inside bathhouses. Yes, you could get a shave, a haircut, a minor surgical procedure, and a steam all in the same building. The medieval version of a day spa, just with more bloodletting and less cucumber water. The barber surgeon might lance a boil, drain an abscess, or yank a tooth, all while the patient sat in a tub trying not to faint into the warm suds. And these weren't just for townsfolk. Wealthy nobles had private bathrooms in their manors, sometimes with heated floors and tubs carved from stone or lined with lead. Hot water was poured in using pitchers warmed by the hearth. Servants stood by with towels and perfumes. Bathing became a performance, a ritual of status and privilege, especially for women, whose bath scenes were sometimes captured in the illuminated margins of manuscripts, equal parts admiration and voyeurism. But even for the poor, bathhouses weren't out of reach. In cities they were often subsidised or run by guilds. Admission was affordable, and in the coldest months, some even offered free hours for the destitute. Not because the city was feeling generous, but because frozen citizens in the streets created a public health nightmare no one wanted to deal with. Now, historians argue over just how often medieval people bathed. The old myth that people didn't bathe in the Middle Ages is wildly oversimplified. Yes, bathing frequency varied. Rural folk might only wash fully every few weeks in winter, relying on hand and face washing in between. Nobles might bathe more often when they could, and townspeople took what they could get. But records of soap makers, bathhouse regulations, and personal hygiene rituals show that people did value cleanliness, even if they weren't scrubbing daily with lavender body wash. You lean back now, water up to your chin, as someone nearby hums a tune, and another person tells a story about a man who bathed so long he turned to soup. Everyone laughs. It's warm here, it's communal, it's messy, noisy, and completely unfiltered. And yet, for a few hours, you forget about the snow piling outside, the wind howling through the gaps in your cottage roof, the cracked hands and the coughing fits. Here in this strange, steamy chamber of the medieval world, winter feels far away. You might not be clean, but you're cleaner. You might not be dry, but you're warm. You might not be safe from the plague, but at least your fingers aren't blue. Eventually, you'll pull yourself from the tub, towel off with a scrap of linen, relayer your damp clothes, and step back out into the dark. Frozen night. The cold will slap your face like a forgotten debt. But something inside you, something deeper than your chilled bones, will still carry the heat. A little flame stolen from the bathhouse. And in the Middle Ages, that counts for everything. You're walking through the cloisters now, feet echoing softly against the cold flagstones as the wind tries its best to worm its way through every crack in the stone. Above you, the vaulted ceiling arches like the ribs of some slumbering beast, and around you the silence feels deeper than snowdrifts. This is monastery life in winter, a place where everything is stripped down to its bare essentials, including heat. And yet somehow monks manage to survive winters here with their fingers intact and their souls presumably unthawed. The air inside the monastery isn't warm. Let's get that out of the way. It's less cold, which isn't quite the same thing. There's no roaring hearth in every hallway, no thick furs or steaming stew on demand. The rule of St. Benedict, followed by many Western monastic communities, emphasised simplicity, self-denial, and, unfortunately for your toes, not wrapping oneself in decadence. That meant cold floors, cold food, cold beds, but also clever workarounds. You follow a monk into the warming room, the one heated chamber allowed in many monastic buildings, especially during winter. It's usually small, often connected to the scriptorium or close to the cloister, and contains a modest fire or brazier. Just one, no more. In some monasteries, only the old or sick were permitted to linger here for long. In others, scribes and copyists were given time slots to thaw their ink-frozen fingers. It's not a place to relax, it's a functional furnace, a necessary evil in a community that viewed comfort as suspicious, and yet, here it is, warmth. A flickering flame in a stone-lined space surrounded by silent, hooded figures, holding manuscripts or warming hands in the folds of their robes. They never speak, of course, not aloud. This is a place of quiet, but the fire crackles, and the shared presence of so many cold bodies near the hearth creates a feeling of communion, a kind of spiritual warmth layered over the physical one. You sit at the edge of the room, cloak wrapped tightly, trying not to be too obvious about how much you're enjoying the heat. You notice how even here, the monks layer their clothing. Wool tunics over linen shirts, hoods, cloaks, sometimes even mittens or fingerless gloves sewn by hand from leftover scraps. Their beds back in the dormitory are hardly beds at all, wooden frames with thin straw mattresses and maybe one blanket. So during the day they rely on motion, discipline and a shared routine to keep the cold from creeping too deep. Let's talk about the scriptorium, the room where monks copied texts. It's cold even with the warming room nearby. You try holding a quill with numb fingers and see how far you get before inking your entire sleeve. Monks often sat with heated stones at their feet or wrapped in cloaks while scribbling away at illuminated manuscripts. Some accounts mention using hand warmers, small ceramic pots filled with hot coals placed under a desk or inside a wool pouch. Quiet, portable heat. Just enough to keep the blood flowing. There's a fringe detail for you. Some monasteries installed early forms of ductwork, stone or clay flues that carried warm air from the kitchen or warming room into adjacent chambers. It wasn't common and it wasn't pretty, but it shows a spark of ingenuity. Heating a monastery without breaking the rules was like playing chess with winter, always trying to stay one move ahead of the frost without making the bishop uncomfortable. Of course, the refectory or dining hall wasn't heated. Meals were taken in silence, with everyone sitting on the cold benches eating warm but often bland food. In winter you'd get hot soup or porridge, perhaps some mulled wine on feast days. Monks learned to eat quickly, efficiently, and to be grateful that the meal was hot even if the room was not. Now, some scholars have argued that monasteries were better off than most secular homes in winter. They had more consistent access to food, dedicated spaces for fire, and communal labour to keep things functioning. Others point out the harsh ascetic lifestyle, the strict rules against indulgence, and the lack of individualised curlew and comfort made monastic life a special kind of frozen purgatory. Both are probably true. You're warm in the warming room, but you know it's temporary. Still, monks were smart. They scheduled their daily hours to align with the sun. Work during daylight, prayer before dawn and after dusk, but little wasted time in between. Less night work meant fewer hours spent shivering in candlelit corridors, and many monasteries were built with south-facing windows designed to trap what little sun existed during the colder months. Again, small architectural moves to nudge the needle towards survivable. There's a spiritual layer to all of this. Cold wasn't just something to fight, it was something to endure, a test, a cleansing element. A monk wasn't supposed to be comfortable. They were supposed to be humble, disciplined and focused. A bit of frostbite, a small price for enlightenment, a sore throat from morning prayer in a snow-laced chapel, all part of the journey. The body was a vessel after all. A little chill might even purify it. Now here's your quirky fact of the night. Some monasteries had heated lavatories. That's right. Warm toilets, not for comfort, but to prevent the freezing and bursting of pipes and to avoid the, unpleasantness of frozen waste. Monks were many things, but they weren't fools. Certain orders took pride in their sanitation systems, using gravity-fed water flow and rudimentary heating to keep things manageable even when everything else turned to ice. You leave the warming room eventually, your fingers tingling from recirculating blood, your bones looser than they were. The cold hits you again, of course it always does, but it feels more bearable now. You walk past the stone cloisters, watching the wind whip across the courtyard where snow has gathered in swirling drifts. A bell tolls in the distance. Prayer time. In this frozen, quiet place, warmth is never guaranteed. But it exists, carefully managed, earned even. A reward for discipline. A flicker of comfort in a life defined by restraint. And in winter, even a single hour of heat can feel like a miracle. You're following a trail through the forest now, narrow, winding and slick with half-frozen mud. The trees above are skeletal and bare, their branches reaching out like bony fingers scraping at the grey sky. This isn't a leisurely walk. This is wood gathering, and in the medieval winter, it's not just a chore, it's a matter of survival. Without a steady supply of fuel, your fire goes out. And when your fire goes out, well, so do you, but here's the catch. You don't actually own these woods. The forest belongs to the local lord, or maybe the church, or maybe it's technically part of the king's game preserve. Whatever the case, it's not yours. And that means the rules about gathering firewood are complicated, political, and enforced by men with swords and very little sympathy for your frozen fingers. There's a difference between deadwood, fallen branches, twigs and debris you're legally allowed to gather, and greenwood, which you're absolutely not allowed to cut without permission. Cutting down a tree or even hacking off a live branch could be punished as theft. In some regions it was considered poaching. You'd be fined, imprisoned, or, if you made a habit of it, worse. So you walk the line, quite literally, between desperation and the law. You're looking for kindling, branches, maybe a fallen tree that's been down long enough that no one will question it. You're careful not to make noise, careful where you step. You're always glancing over your shoulder, because if a forester catches you with an axe in hand and no license to use it, you're in trouble. And if you're carrying more than a small bundle of twigs, You might be accused of stealing the Lord's wood even if it's been rotting for months. And here's the frustrating irony. You live here. You farm the dead. You pay your taxes. You've probably helped build the fences and roads that border this very forest. But when winter comes and you need to heat your home, you have to beg, bribe, or sneak around for firewood while entire groves stand unused behind manor walls. So how did people get their fuel? In several ways, depending on their status, region, and risk tolerance. Some families had wood rights, small, often inherited permissions to gather from a specific part of the forest. Others relied on commons land where shared resources could be harvested, though those rights were slowly eroded over time by enclosure laws and greedy landowners. You see someone else up ahead, an old woman dragging a bundle of sticks in a basket strapped to her back. She nods at you, but doesn't stop. She's got her haul, and she's heading home before the snow picks up again. You follow suit, collecting enough for the day, maybe enough for tomorrow if you're lucky. It's not just wood either. You gather peat, dried dung, crop waste, whatever can burn without choking you or collapsing your roof. In towns, things are different, but not easier. Urban households often buy firewood, especially in winter when the market is flooded with damp logs at gouged up prices. There are wood vendors, sawyers, and fuel merchants who cart their goods through the streets yelling prices and weighing logs on crooked scales. The poor can rarely afford good hardwood. They get softwood skips, bark, or shavings. Sometimes there's burned straw or bundles of reeds tied up like sad little torches. In wealthier homes, especially castles and monasteries, wood is delivered in bulk, stacked in sheds or cellars, seasoned properly, and distributed by servants. There's usually a wood warden, an official charged with managing the estate's firewood supply. He decides which rooms get how much, when, and for how long. The kitchen always gets first priority. The Great Hall is next. Servants' quarters and storage rooms come last, if at all. Here's your quirky fact of the night. Some medieval estates had entire calendars devoted to firewood usage, dividing the year into burning seasons and regulating how much could be used each month. Certain types of wood were reserved for special purposes: oak for heating, willow for weaving, yew for bows. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was free. And sometimes, wood collection became a community effort. Villages organised shared expeditions into the forest, especially after storms or heavy wind, when dead branches littered the ground. It was safer to go in groups, less risk of getting accused of theft or mauled by a boar, or simply freezing to death out there alone. Kids were often sent to collect sticks and kindling, learning early that fire didn't just appear in the hearth. It was earned. But not all families could gather enough, and when the fuel ran out, homes went cold. People turned to burning furniture, ripping up old stools, benches, even door frames if they had to. There are records of desperate winters where villagers burned their own roofs, removing thatch layer by layer to feed the flames. One shingle at a time. That's not just resourceful, that's tragic. There's still debate among historians about just how restricted fuel access really was. Some argue that forest laws were harsh but inconsistently enforced, and peasants often knew which trees to cut and which foresters could be bribed. Others point to records of widespread fuel shortages and brutal penalties for even minor infractions. What's clear is that winter firewood wasn't guaranteed, and many families faced it with more anxiety than they ever admitted aloud. You head home now, arms full of twigs, shoulders sore, the cold cutting at your ears. But there's a satisfaction to it. You've got fuel. The fire will burn tonight. Maybe not all night, maybe not strong, but enough. Enough to cook a meal, warm the bedstones, dry your cloak. You pass other homes with smoke curling from the roofs, and for a moment you feel part of something larger, a whole community clinging to its heat. The fire in your hearth isn't just a comfort. It's the final product of a complex economy, a political battleground, a dance with nature, and a little bit of luck. Every stick you burn was fought for, gathered, traded, stolen or sacrificed. And tonight, it's yours. It's deep winter now, the kind of cold that settles into your bones like bad news. The sky's been grey for days, and the snow outside is crusted over with ice. Your breath hangs in the air indoors, and even the fire seems reluctant to roar. But for once, you're not chopping wood, chasing livestock, or heating cabbage water for the 5th time. Tonight you're doing something different. Something ancient, chaotic, and strangely warm. You're celebrating, because even in the bleakest months, medieval people didn't just endure winter, they found ways to laugh at it, mock it, and throw parties in its face. Welcome to the season of winter festivals and fire rituals, where light pushes back against the long dark and heat isn't just physical, it's spiritual, communal, and sometimes just plain wild. You're standing in a village square now, boots half buried in packed snow, surrounded by neighbours bundled in cloaks, furs, and whatever else they've managed to scavenge or steal from the attic. A bonfire crackles in the centre, tall and furious, casting orange light onto faces rosy from drink and cold. Someone is singing a bawdy song. Someone else is trying to dance with two left boots. Everyone's breathing steam and grinning like they've forgotten for just one night how miserable everything is. This is the Feast of St. Brigid. Or maybe it's Imbolc, or Candlemas, or some local fire festival with a name no one remembers, only that it involves fire, feasting and shouting very loudly into the night. Pagan and Christian traditions bleed together here, like wax melting on snow. What matters isn't the theology, it's the heat. Many winter festivals were fire-based for one simple reason. Fire gives hope. Long nights, short days, frozen furrows, food, dead animals. Coughs that won't go away, it all becomes bearable when you stand beside a flame that says, "We're still here." Bonfires were lit on hillsides and in village centres not just for warmth but to bless the coming season. Drive away spirits, or just remind the darkness that it doesn't own everything. And let's not pretend this was all reverent, solemn torch-holding. These were parties. People danced, drank, sang, wore masks, swapped stories, and in many cases, engaged in behaviour that probably made their parish priest quietly weep into his robes. Especially during festivals like Twelfth Night or Carnival, which marked the chaotic, joyful end of the Christmas season and the lead up to Lent. You've got torches waving in the air, roasted meat on sticks, cups of hot mead or ale being passed around like communion chalices. Children wear paper crowns or sheepskin capes. Someone in a straw costume chases goats around the fire. It's tradition, don't ask. And in the middle of it all, the fire burns on, fed by logs carried from each household, each one a symbolic contribution to the shared warmth. There's a long-standing tradition of Yule logs, especially in Northern Europe. A massive log, sometimes so large it had to be dragged by oxen, was brought into the home and burned slowly throughout the 12 days of Christmas. It was supposed to smoulder gently, never going out. People would save a piece of it for the next year, using it to light the new log, ensuring continuity, luck, and protection from house fires, which is, ironically, optimistic. In some places, the ashes of the Yule log were sprinkled on crops, kept under the bed for fertility, or mixed with herbs to ward off illness. You're not sure how many of these rituals worked, but that's hardly the point. These were survival stories disguised as tradition. Ways of folding warmth into meaning, of saying, this fire matters, it connects us to the past and it will carry us forward. And fire wasn't just about festivals, it played a role in rituals of healing. If someone fell ill in the dead of winter, a candle might be lit and placed at their feet or beside their bed. Not just for light, but as a symbolic fire to fight the chill of death. In some folk practices, fires were walked around the perimeter of a home to keep out evil spirits, or drive out the cold. Literal heat plus a little superstition equals one more night survived. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In some alpine villages, fire races were held. People, yes, actual humans, ran through the snow carrying burning torches, sometimes uphill, sometimes around the entire village, as a ritual to chase away winter and summon spring. It sounds insane. It probably was, but it also looked spectacular, and let's be honest, any excuse to sprint while on fire in medieval Europe was probably the social event of the month. Even within the church, candles were central to winter rituals. Candlemas, celebrated in early February, marked the official end of the Christmas season and the blessing of all the church's candles for the coming year. It was both a sacred observance and a deeply practical one. More light meant more work, more warmth, more life. People would bring candles from home to be blessed, hoping to carry that holy fire back into their smoke-stained cottages. Now, some scholars argue that these fire festivals were more symbolic than functional. A bonfire in the square won't heat your home, a torchlit procession won't stop your toes from going numb, but others argue the emotional warmth was just as important. In a season when people often died quietly in their sleep, when food ran out and the dark seemed endless, fire festivals gave structure, purpose, a reason to gather, a reason to believe in spring. You sit beside the bonfire now, feeling the heat on your face, your back still cold, but less so. Someone hands you a drink, spiced, warm, a little too strong. You take a sip. You laugh at a story you've heard before. You watch the sparks rise up into the dark sky and disappear, like tiny souls. For one night you're not cold, not alone, not worried about whether the firewood will last, or if the goat's pregnant again, or if the thatch above your head is mouldy. For one night you have ritual, you have fire, you have people standing beside you, each of them clutching warmth like it's something sacred. Because it is. You're standing on a stone parapet now, the wind cutting at your face like a jealous ghost. Below you stretches the frozen landscape, white, jagged, silent. You're in a castle, a real one. Not the fairy tale kind with polished marble and singing chambermaids, but the cold, damp, defensive kind with narrow halls and walls so thick they could stop an angry ox. You'd think all that stone would keep the heat in, but here's a fun discovery. It doesn't. It just holds the cold hostage. Let's talk about how castles were heated during medieval winters, or more accurately, how they tried and frequently failed to be heated. Because for all their grandeur and military brilliance, castles were, in many cases, just glorified wind tunnels. The stone walls retained cold like a grudge. The ceilings were high enough to lose all warmth within seconds. And the windows? Drafty slits or glassless holes plugged with shutters and hope. But that doesn't mean they gave up, far from it. You turn away from the bitter breeze and head inside, down a spiral staircase worn smooth from centuries of pacing boots. You're heading for the one place where heat actually lives. The Great Hall. This is the heart of the castle, the social hub, the courtroom, the dining room, the gossip mill, and most importantly during winter, the heating centre. At the far end, a massive fireplace gapes open like a stone mouth, blackened by centuries of smoke. The fire burning inside is wide and deep, filled with logs the size of coffins, and even so the warmth barely reaches halfway across the room. You can actually see the warm zone, where people cluster with their hands outstretched, and the cold zone, where unlucky souls sit in full cloaks, sipping lukewarm broth and pretending to enjoy it. Still, this is as good as it gets. The hearth in the Great Hall was usually the largest in the castle. Sometimes it was raised. Sometimes it had an elaborate hood to guide smoke into a flue or chimney, if you were lucky enough to live after those became common. Early medieval castles just vented smoke into the room through the louvre, a hole in the roof that was supposed to let it escape. Often it didn't, so if you wanted to be warm, you also had to be smoked like a ham. There's a roaring argument among architectural historians about when chimneys actually became widespread. Some say they were common by the 12th century in wealthier estates. Others argue they didn't catch on until the 14th or even 15th. What's certain is that before chimneys, smoke just filled the space above your head, layering the ceiling with soot and your lungs with regret. It gave everything that authentic medieval campfire flavour, except it never stopped. Now, while the Great Hall had the main fire, other parts of the castle weren't so lucky. Most rooms, bedchambers, kitchens, servants' quarters, had small fireplaces or braziers. The fireplaces were shallow, inefficient, and hard to keep lit. The braziers were portable metal bowls filled with hot coals, good for spot heating but absolute nightmares if knocked over by a stray boot. Which, you know, happened a lot. Some castles had underfloor heating systems, borrowing the Roman Hippocaust method. These were rare and mostly found in monasteries or certain elite Norman estates that were really trying to flex. But for the most part, castles relied on strategic room usage. People gathered where the fire was. You didn't sit alone in a freezing tower chamber unless you were banished, dramatic, or writing very depressing poetry. In fact, entire wings of the castle would be closed off in winter just to consolidate heat. Servants would hang tapestries on stone walls, not for decoration, though they looked great, but for insulation. Heavy cloth draped over walls and doors helped block drafts and absorb some of the cold air radiating from the stone. It didn't make things warm, but it took the edge off. A bit like putting socks on a statue and hoping it'll feel something. You walk past one of these tapestries now, faded red and gold, a unicorn tangled in vines, and press your hand to the wall behind it. Still cold, but less than it would be. Nearby, a noblewoman sits in a high-backed wooden chair, pulled close to the fire, wrapped in layers of velvet and fur. That's another trick, furniture design. High-backed chairs weren't just fashionable, they acted like personal heat shields, blocking drafts from behind while focusing the fire's warmth on your front. Clothing, of course, played a huge role. People wore multiple layers. Undergarments, tunics, cloaks, furs. You might have linen close to the skin, then wool, then fur, topped with a hood or cap. Gloves, mittens, Wool stockings, even foot wraps stuffed with straw or fur were used to keep the cold out. At night, you piled on the blankets and prayed no one stole your warming stone. And here's your oddball fact for the evening. Some castles employed warming pans, long-handled metal pans filled with coals slid between bedsheets before you got in. Sounds familiar? Yes, it's the aristocratic cousin of the peasant's bedstone. Except when the servant forgot to check the pan's temperature, it had a tendency to set the bed on fire. Cosy. Let's not forget the servants, many of whom slept in the kitchens, not because anyone cared about their comfort, but because the residual heat helped them survive the night. The kitchen itself, tucked away in its own wing to reduce fire risk, was the castle's secondary heat source. When it wasn't being used, its fire was kept smouldering because relighting it from scratch was a nightmare, and letting it go out was worse. You head up now to one of the towers, narrow stairs spiralling toward the sky. You pass arrow slits that let in more wind than light, and finally reach a guard room. There's a brazier here, glowing weakly, with 2 guards slumped beside it, cloaks pulled over their faces. They nod at you, too cold to speak. This room was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be defensible. Warmth was secondary, like very secondary. And yet castles weren't designed with total misery in mind. Every architectural choice, from hearth placement to ceiling height to where tapestries were hung, was part of a long, slow evolution of figuring out how to keep people alive inside giant stone fortresses. The results weren't always successful, but they were clever, adaptive, intentional. You descend again to the great hall. The fire is still burning, sparks curling upward, people clustered close, murmuring, laughing. It's the warmest spot in the entire fortress. Not just physically, emotionally, because in a place built for war, the fire is the one thing that reminds everyone what peace might feel like. You sit, stretch your feet toward the flame, and let it thaw the chill out of your bones. Outside, the snow falls silently on the battlements, but inside the hall, the fire holds. You're padding down the corridor now in fur-lined slippers that cost more than most peasants see in a year, your breath not fogging in the air for once. Because this part of the house, mercifully, is warm. You're in the private quarters of a noble family, and tonight, you're about to find out exactly what the medieval elite did to stay warm, while everyone else was collecting twigs and losing fingers. Balls. Let's start with the most obvious difference. You're not cold, not really. Maybe the floor is chilly if you step off the carpet. And sure, there's a draft under the door because even your castle walls aren't airtight, but compared to the barn-scented freeze fest going on in the village, you're basically summering in luxury. The noble's bedroom, often called a sola, isn't just where people slept. It was the private sanctuary for warmth, leisure, and the occasional politically loaded embroidery session. And while it's still made of stone, the walls are hung with heavy tapestries that help seal in what little heat there is. Overhead, thick wooden beams support a ceiling that doesn't leak. At least not today. The bed itself, a 4-poster fortress of warmth draped in velvet, wool and fur, with a canopy that traps heat like a medieval sauna tent. You pull back the covers and see them piled deep. Feather mattress, fur blankets, quilted counterpanes, and at least one hot brick wrapped in cloth still radiating its earthy glow. You touch it briefly, not for warmth, but out of respect. Someone down in the kitchen heated that brick just for you, carried it up the stairs and slid it between the sheets like a glowing apology for how miserable the rest of the world is right now. And yes, servants. That's a major part of how the nobility stayed warm. Other people. Not to snuggle with, although that happened too, but to keep the fire stoked, fetch warm clothing, prepare hot drinks, heat bedding and stand nearby just in case your noble toes needed attention. The wealthy were not above assigning someone to watch the fire through the night, just to make sure it didn't die and leave them tragically lukewarm by morning. But that's just nighttime. During the day, nobles had options, private hearths, portable braziers, and entire chambers designed around managing heat. The solar was usually placed on the upper floor to catch more sunlight and stay away from the damp chill of the ground. Windows were small, often glazed if you were truly rich, and set deep into the walls with wooden shutters and thick curtains drawn tight against the wind. You pull on a robe now, lined in squirrel fur maybe, or even ermine if your family's doing particularly well this season. Fur wasn't just a fashion statement, it was insulation. Nobles wore layers upon layers, even indoors, woolen hose, padded doublets, linen underclothes, and cloaks heavy enough to make you look like a walking tent. The more layers, the more status. And if you were really wealthy, you didn't just wear fur, you ate it. metaphorically speaking, by warming your insides with rich food and drink. Let's talk about heated drinks, spiced wine, mulled ale, herbal infusions with honey, hot broths thick with marrow. These were common ways to warm the body from within. A noble woman might sip posset in the evening, a warm drink made from milk curdled with wine or ale, spiced with cinnamon or ginger. It sounds disgusting, and sometimes it was, but it was warm. And warmth always wins in winter. Here's your quirky fact of the evening. Some nobles kept tiny dogs, not just for companionship, but for body heat. Lapdogs were basically living hot water bottles, and they were treated accordingly, tucked into cloaks, slipped under blankets, and given a place in the bed. Medieval people weren't subtle about it either. They literally called them comfort dogs. You're not cuddling that fluffy spaniel for fun, you're surviving. Meanwhile, the servants who made all this possible were freezing. The kitchen staff slept near the ovens, if they were lucky, while others shivered in attic crawl spaces or unheated halls. Their work was constant, fetching wood, cleaning ashes, carrying heated stones upstairs, boiling water, airing linens, and replacing fire logs at the exact moment the current one hit critical ember. There was no such thing as a warm nap if you were a chambermaid. Let's not forget the toilets, because yes, even nobles had to deal with that. Privies were cold, draughty, and often located outside or overhanging the outer walls. To ease the Arctic horror of relieving oneself in the dead of night, some noble homes had guardrobes with fur-lined seats or even toilet cloaks, garments specifically worn during winter trips to the loo. And no, that doesn't make it glamorous, it just makes it slightly less traumatic. There's some scholarly disagreement about how consistently nobles had access to heat throughout their homes. Some argue that even the elite couldn't escape the harshness of medieval winters, pointing to surviving castles with minimal fireplaces and no chimneys. Others argue that the rich simply didn't use their whole house in winter, choosing instead to cluster in a few warm rooms, leaving ballrooms and galleries to freeze while they lived in a toasty bubble of luxury. That bubble had limits, of course. Noble children still got sick. Cold-related illnesses like chilblains, pneumonia and winter fevers didn't discriminate, but wealth could mitigate the damage. Heated beds, warm food, well-made clothing, and a rotating staff of people whose job it was to keep you comfortable. That's the medieval cheat code for winter. You pull up a high-back chair near the fire, settle in with your fur robe, and watch as a servant carefully adjusts the logs with a poker carved like a lion's paw. The fire flares. The heat pulses outward. You sip your mulled wine. Somewhere below, someone's carrying up another stone, freshly pulled from the oven. You'll place it at the foot of the bed tonight and sleep without your teeth chattering. Luxury in the Middle Ages isn't measured in gold or jewels. It's measured in warmth. Who has it? Who makes it? Who sleeps through the night without waking to frost on their eyelashes? Tonight, you're one of the lucky ones. Just warm enough to forget how rare that is. The fire has burned low. You're lying in bed now, bundled beneath layers of wool, fur and fatigue, your breath just barely visible in the cold air. The stone walls around you are quiet, and for a moment it feels peaceful, like winter has finally agreed to leave you alone. But you know better, because sometimes in the Middle Ages, even a roaring hearth and a mountain of blankets weren't enough. Sometimes the cold won. This is the side of winter no one sings about, the part of the season where warmth becomes a memory, and silence isn't cosy. It's a warning. In towns, in villages, in castles and abbeys, when the fire goes out and the food runs low, people begin to disappear. Quietly, at night, sometimes in their sleep, sometimes still sitting by the hearth that just couldn't burn hot enough. Winter mortality was very real. Every year, as the frost set in and snow layered rooftops like icing on a dying cake, people began to fall ill, respiratory infections, influenza-like illnesses, frostbite, hypothermia, and perhaps worst of all, simple starvation. The early medieval world didn't have flu shots or space heaters. You got sick, you got cold, you got worse. The line between under the weather and under the ground could be one long night without a fire. You sit up slightly, staring into the dying embers of the hearth. There's something a little haunting about a fire that's gone cold. Not just physically, it feels like failure. Like something ancient and primal just gave up on you. No more warmth, no more light. Just ashes and the faint scent of burnt wood. Outside your house, if you're lucky enough to have one, people talk about signs. They say frost in the corners of a child's eyes is a bad omen. That if you see your breath but not your shadow, something has followed you home. That cold isn't just weather, it's a thing creeping in under doors and through dreams, taking people not by violence but by stillness. In some regions, folklore painted winter not as a season, but as a creature, a pale rider, an old woman with iron teeth, a silent wraith that moved through the village in the night, touching foreheads, snuffing out candles, stealing the last warmth from the hearth. You laugh a little at the thought, half because it's ridiculous, and half because some nights it doesn't feel that far-fetched. Even the church struggled with how to explain winter deaths. Were they punishment for sin? A test of faith? A reminder of humanity's fragility? Monks wrote prayers for warmth and survival. Priests blessed hearths and gave sermons on the virtue of suffering. People lit candles for the departed, and sometimes just to keep their own courage lit. There was comfort in ritual, but not always in results. In the countryside, the signs of a hard winter were everywhere. The roads became impassable, food had to be rationed, dung piles froze solid, wells iced over. In some years, entire families perished in their sleep, found days later, curled together under layers of cloth and snow. There were no coroners, no forensics, just stories and memories, if anyone survived to tell them. And then there were the myths that filled in the gaps, tales of spirits who lived in the hearth, leaving if the fire wasn't fed. Stories of souls that wandered in the cold because they hadn't been buried properly. In some regions, people left out coal or embers for the dead, just in case they were passing through. It wasn't just superstition, it was kindness. Maybe even insurance. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. In parts of northern Europe, people practiced winter watching, a kind of informal night patrol in which villagers took turns walking the perimeter of the community to check for dying fires, unguarded homes, and signs of illness. It wasn't official, it wasn't organised. Just people trying to make sure everyone made it through the night. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. You lean back against your pillow now, the chill creeping in under your blankets. You think about all the people who didn't wake up. All the houses where the fire went out and no one noticed until the smell crept into the street. It's easy to romanticize medieval winter. The cosy fires, the hot stew, the shared beds. But the reality was often colder, grimmer, and far more fragile. And yet, people didn't give up. They found warmth wherever they could. In shared meals, in bundled blankets, in crowded taverns and steamy bathhouses, in rituals and festivals and simple stubborn determination, in fires that burned all night, even when the wind howled like a hungry dog at the door. Historians still debate the full impact of winter on medieval mortality. Some claim it was no worse than any other season, just different dangers. Others argue that winter was the true reaper, quietly thinning out the weakest each year without fanfare. The truth probably lies in between. Winter didn't kill everyone, but it reminded everyone that they could be killed. You stare into the embers one last time before closing your eyes. The cold is real, but so is the blanket pulled over your shoulders. So is the fire that, though dim, hasn't quite gone out. You're still here. And in the medieval world, sometimes that was the only victory that mattered. You survived the night. The sun rises reluctantly, spilling pale light over a snow-blanketed village that looks peaceful, too peaceful, like it's holding its breath of Nebith. Smoke curls from a few chimneys, show and heavy in the frozen air. You wake slowly, every joint creaking, every muscle groaning like it's auditioning for sainthood. But you're alive. The fire burned low but not out. The room is cold but not unbearable. You've made it through another medieval winter night, and now you're facing the final stretch of a long, frozen season. Because while winter in the Middle Ages was brutal, it wasn't endless. Eventually the thaw comes, slowly, subtly. But it comes, and when it does, it changes everything, not just the air, but how people move, work, gather, and heat their homes. You're about to see what it's like when survival shifts from endurance back to hope. The first sign isn't birdsong or green shoots. It's mud. That glorious, miserable, everywhere mud. Frozen roads begin to melt, turning into ankle-deep rivers of filth and runoff. The snow piles collapse under their own soggy weight. And suddenly, everyone's house starts leaking again. But no one really complains. Because mud means movement. Mud means heat. Mud means the sun's winning, if only a little. Inside your home, the fire is still the centerpiece, but it's burning less constantly now. You're rationing wood more carefully, knowing the days will slowly warm. The worst has passed. The bed doesn't feel like a coffin anymore. You can actually step outside without your breath snapping in half. You start looking towards spring chores, repairs, planting, rebuilding what winter destroyed. In wealthier homes, people emerge like nervous deer blinking at the sun. The heavy fur cloaks are swapped for lighter layers. Fires are still lit in the evening, but now they're smaller, used for comfort rather than survival. The ash bins are emptied, hearths cleaned, walls aired out. Even noble houses begin preparing for the seasonal transition, slowly reopening parts of the house that had been sealed off for the season. One of the most important post-winter rituals was fumigation. Yes, people literally smoked their homes. Herbs, incense, and burning branches were waved through hallways and over beds to chase out the bad air of winter. The idea of miasma, foul air causing disease, was strong, and after months of sealed windows and coughing children, it made a kind of desperate sense. And with the thaw came the reawakening of communal life. Villagers who had barely seen one another for weeks began to gather again in the square, sharing news, stories, maybe a bit of ale if someone's barrel hadn't frozen solid. Local festivals started popping up, simple affairs, sometimes just an excuse to light one more bonfire and celebrate the fact that everyone wasn't dead. Your fringe fact for the final night: in some medieval towns there were official fire maintenance days at the end of winter. On these days, communal ovens and hearths were cleaned, wood stores inventoried, and smoke holes inspected. It was part sanitation, part superstition, a way to prepare homes for spring and clear out the ghosts of winter, both literal and metaphorical. Even the church got involved. Special blessing rituals were performed in homes and fields, often involving holy water, candles, and prayers for protection against late frosts. Clergy would visit households to sprinkle lintels and thresholds, symbolically sealing in the warmth and asking for divine help to keep the plague or a hailstorm away. Yet for all the relief of spring, there was also a kind of quiet grief. Winter was cruel, yes, but it also bound people together. Families huddled for warmth, communities shared food, fire, even sleeping space. The darkest months forced connection. With the warmth returning, so did space and distance and the quiet unravelling of the close-knit cocoon winter had built. You sit now outside your home, on a stool that's no longer frozen to the ground, watching as the villagers move like newly freed prisoners. Someone is repairing a fence. Someone else is hauling what's left of the firewood into storage. Children are chasing each other with muddy boots. A woman shakes out a blanket that smells like hearth smoke and old bread. Life is coming back, and for a moment you let yourself feel proud you survived, not just with warmth, but with wit, with borrowed tricks, stolen heat, shared breath, and a stubborn refusal to go cold quietly. Every ember, every fur, every bowl of garlic soup, every awkward group cuddle on the straw mattress. It all added up to something astonishing. Because surviving a medieval winter wasn't about brute strength. It was about adaptability, cooperation, ritual, innovation. Whether you were a peasant stuffing straw into your boots, a monk copying texts near a heated wallstone, or a noble sipping posset under a velvet curtain, you played your part in humanity's longest seasonal chess match. Historians still debate how many didn't make it. There are records of famine, disease, sudden freezes, villages buried in snow or cut off from supplies, but the fact that we know these stories means enough people made it through. They passed down their methods, their rituals, their recipes, their warnings. They taught us how to light fires in dark places and keep them alive long enough to see the sun again. You step inside, close the door, and look one last time at the hearth. The fire doesn't need to burn all night anymore, but it still crackles, soft, steady, a heartbeat in the home. And so, medieval winter ends not with a bang or a blaze, but with a flicker, just enough light to see your way into spring. So now that you've made it all the way through 25 nights beside the fire, in castles and cottages, monasteries and taverns, shivering in bathhouses and sweating in dog-piled beds, you finally get to do what few medieval people could. Relax, the fires are banked, the last snows are melting. And you're still here, wrapped in the lingering warmth of all the human ingenuity, stubbornness and straight-up weirdness it took to survive a winter without insulation, central heating or even reliable socks. You've hauled wood from forbidden forests, stuffed straw into shoes, huddled in smoky rooms, eaten garlic suck soup and drank suspicious wine, all in the name of staying warm. You've watched nobles summon comfort with layers of fur and steaming stones. You've seen peasants make miracles with shared beds and clay pots of glowing coals. And through it all, there's been this one quiet, persistent truth. heat was never guaranteed. It was earned, negotiated, shared. And you did share it across time and across space. Whether you were lighting a communal fire on a winter festival night, sitting elbow to elbow in a smoky tavern, or just holding hands with your equally freezing family around the hearth, warmth in the Middle Ages wasn't a solitary experience. It was collective. It was survival through connection. That's probably the biggest takeaway, isn't it? That in a world where the walls leaked, the roofs sagged, and the sun went on vacation for half the year, people made it work by pulling closer together. Not just for body heat, but for stories, for songs, for belief, for laughter in the face of frostbite. So maybe, if you're lying in a warm bed right now with a decent blanket and a functioning radiator, give a little nod to the firemakers of the past, the ones who figured it out before thermostats and heating oil, because your comfort tonight is just a very modern ember of a very old flame. Now the lights are low, the fire has burned down to its last gentle glow, outside the wind is just a whisper, and inside the warmth lingers. Not loud, not flashy, just enough. Like it always was. Sleep well. You earned it, dear.